Summary. In a seemingly idyllic Midwest town, an annual fundraising event triggers a spiral of infidelity, revenge, and supernatural intrigue. John, a devoted husband, discovers his wife Hester's betrayal, and in his turmoil, begins an affair with his seductive co-worker, Emily. As John's guilt and anger consume him, Hester, seeking solace, uncovers John's affair and learns that Emily is the sister of her former lover, Mark. The revelation ignites a web of deceit, exposing a calculated plot by Emily and Mark to ruin both John and Hester. The story takes a darker turn as werewolf lore entwines with human drama, revealing that John and Hester's new lovers are not just ordinary people, but part of a sinister werewolf conspiracy. As explicit encounters and violent confrontations escalate, the primal instincts of the werewolf clan unleash a series of deadly events. Trust is shattered, and alliances are tested in a town where power and passion collide. In a night of bloodshed and betrayal, secrets are laid bare, and the true extent of the conspiracy is revealed. The climax sees a brutal showdown where the werewolf instincts lead to a ferocity that leaves a trail of death. Ultimately, Hester emerges as the sole survivor, her life forever altered by the vengeance-fueled chaos that claimed her husband, their lovers, and the conspirators. Wolf's Vendetta is a tale of lust, power, and primal revenge that will keep readers on the edge of their seats. Chapter 1. Justin had first met Jex when the kid was 6, small framed with eyes dark as night. He'd stood on the other side of a dead body, pooling blood around his feet. The dead guy had been one of Jex's bodyguards, and the kid had watched calmly, while his father went into a rant about something long forgotten before he'd pulled the trigger. Jex's feet hadn't been the only thing covered in blood, but like the gore around him, he'd stood still watching chaos encircling him, a deathbringer in all his glory, until he blinked at his father, turning his head slightly, and in a voice so scarily soft, making a shiver work down Justin's back, Jex had wondered if it was okay for him to clean up. It hadn't been the first time Jex had watched the death of one of his father's men, and it wouldn't be the last. To Justin, it was almost as if death and pain had been so ingrained in him, he didn't know the difference. It had taken him a few years to realize the man was actually quite gentle with those he held close. For all he chose to do that for, they'd ask for nothing. Unfortunately, that spot had only one member, and Justin was looking at him. Matthew Smith. At least he was one of the many men that stood in the light flooded front yard of a huge property. Tucked away from prying eyes, the house itself sat on the top of a hill, a king looking down upon his kingdom. Justin shook his head as the voices started up. A new car brought in all the clutter as two men stood off against each other. The fight was clearly a lover's spat. The body language wasn't hate but anger, and it vibrated around them with something Justin would call hurt. He couldn't make out what they were saying, and quite honestly he didn't care. Getting involved, wondering what it would be like to join them in those jokes and family feelings, would only make him soft, and he couldn't allow that. Justin had watched the family a little longer than he'd ever done before. He tried to tell himself it was because he needed to find the weak link. He wanted the perfect moment to go in and take Jex, but he knew it was a lie. Just as he knew he wasn't meant to be watching one little twink who wasn't his target. Small, innocent, boy next door quality with big eyes and curly blonde hair, the kid's thin body was Justin's perfect match, and he gathered he'd gone way too long between fucks, because whenever the little man came into view, he'd not taken his eyes off him. Tossing his binoculars onto the passenger seat, Justin let his head fall back against the headrest, closing his eyes with a huge sigh. What the fuck was wrong with him? Rubbing his face, he tried his hardest to rid his mind of the little guy. Speaking of tall, he was calling someone little when he'd made his career riding on the anger of being small. Letting his hands drop, he fluttered his eyes open slightly, scanning. He was always scanning. It was ingrained in him as a kid. He constantly needed to know what was happening around him at all times. Something moved just inside the tree line. Ducking down a little more in his seat, he could still see through the holes in the steering wheel, and yet knew whoever it was wouldn't see him. As he watched the shadow grow larger on the paved road, his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Whoever it was would show itself soon enough. The hairs along his back stood up. His gut gave a kick, as it always did when the mission was about to start. However, that normally started when he was lying down on the ground with his rifle in hand, and not sitting in the car, still on stakeout. The man came out of the trees cautiously, though clearly he wasn't afraid. Someone would discover him. Still, by the way he stood there, maybe what he'd spied wasn't what he wanted to be seeing, because he clearly looked dejected. Justin just sat staring at the man who was looking intently at the house, and all Justin wanted to do was pull out his gun and shoot the fucker. He wasn't sure why, and for more reasons than not, he would never be able to shoot someone who looked as if his day had just turned a fuckload worse by the sight of the front of a house. Yet his being there set Justin on edge. He thought maybe it had more to do with the feelings bubbling around his heart, squeezing it up tightly. Something major, fucking life-changing was about to happen, and there wasn't anything he could do about it. He'd had these feelings before. They were the ones that allowed him to disappear before the cops raided a place, to know the perfect time to pull the trigger, or to take the guy he was kidnapping off the streets. It wasn't something he ignored, at least not since he was a teen, when it helped him avoid his father's rages. The problem was, whatever it was had enabled him to sense what was about to happen, but he couldn't do anything but roll with it. Things in this world needed to be played out, and no matter how much he tried to run the other way, sooner or later he'd end up back here, waiting for this bullshit to start. The guy at the tree stood up straight, looked towards him, a quick scan, and then passed on by. He clearly could not see Justin before he trotted off towards the block of land with the hedging and house on the hill that held Jack. Justin's eyes tracked him, watching a trained man run across a road, and suddenly it became clear in his eyes that the man at the forest edge was well trained and apparently clumsy, he thought, as the guy went arse over tit over the barbed wire fencing that lined the property on either side of the hedging. Sitting up, Justin grabbed his rifle from under the back seat as well as one of his smaller survival packs, and then as quietly and quickly as he could, he got himself out of the car. He locked it remotely, the solid thunk of the buttons descending, letting him know the car was secure. He was proud as fuck of the car he'd customized for stalking. Bag settled across his back, Justin took off across the street, ending up on the opposite side of the hedges that the other guy had tripped over. Ducking underneath the wire, he thanked his small-built frame, because he now understood it wasn't clumsiness that made the man fall, but rather shit wiring. Justin crouched down behind the trees, completely out of sight, as he watched all the men on the top of the hill turn their heads in the other guy's direction before one took off after him. Justin reached back to pull his scope from a side pocket in his bag and looked at what was going on. It wasn't that he really thought there was a problem, but more like something was happening that he didn't want to miss. He watched as one of the bigger guys who hung around Jax, the red blonde one, tackled the forest chap. Shit got rough before the flash of a knife caught Justin's eyes, and his muscles worked for him. A 1-2 choreographed movement, and he was on one knee, his rifle resting against his shoulder, the scope locked on top, and his eyes trained on the millisecond of movement as they worked in front of him. It wasn't that things were moving slowly, more that his mind had been trained to take in everything, process it, and spit it out as if he were watching catsup drip, and he was able to switch what he needed to slow motion. His breath sighed out of him in long, smooth movements, and his body became a part of his weapon. Justin knew he wouldn't feel a thing until he was able to debrief. Things worked quickly, as he let himself become the surroundings. The men wrestling on the ground went from beating the shit out of each other to who would be the one who could get their cock in a hole the fastest, while the rest of the house watched on. Lights flashed past him. A car left, and Justin knew who it was just by looks. Even if he didn't know names, a tall, dark, brooding type of face, clearly frantic over the pace the car was moving. Justin watched on, as he did with everything else in life. He was there, right alongside everyone else, and yet they would never know he existed. It wasn't until he saw the smile on his twink's face that a twinge hit his heart, making him want to rub the spot, stand up, and join in on the fun like a normal person. And once the kissing and rutting had started, it made his heat rise into his face as his legs twitched, again making him want to stand up and storm over there, grab up his twink, and not allow him to see the show. He understood the stupidity of his wants and dreams. He wasn't there for his own purpose, no matter how much his body begged him to dump everything and live in this out-of-the-way town. No one would ever know. No one would miss you. No one would come looking. All points were true, and Justin had taken 3 steps towards the group before he realized the stupidity of himself. He wasn't a little kid anymore. He didn't have a right to dream or live in idle thoughts. He had a job to do, and if he didn't get it done, his life was over. He just wished it made a difference. He just wished he couldn't see the better option standing in front of him. Realizing he was thinking like a child rather than the adult he was, Justin unclipped his scope and looked at the damage he might have caused by his sudden movements. He'd never been sloppy before, never taken his body off the job, even in those times of boredom when his mind wandered to more pleasant times. He nearly physically stood back when his eyes caught and held on his twink. He really needed to stop calling the kid that. Hell, he needed to stop thinking about him in the first place, forcing himself to put his mind back on the job he was supposed to do. His twink was looking back at Justin. At least that was his first thought, the second one being more rational. Facts were no one could see him, not at this distance, with nothing but bare eyes, and even though the night wasn't that dark, it was still enough to make distances scramble together. It didn't take long for the mood to shift and for everyone to reach the area, and with that the words came. Things were said, yelled, but it was controlled. Enough that Justin could only hear the heightened noise, not make out what anyone was saying. The men, no matter how young they looked, they were all clearly in their mid-20s adults. And the one in the center, the guy who'd ran across the street, got real jumpy, looking around himself so much that he had Justin moving, skating around the side of the house, the opposite from where the others were. Justin made it to the back just as the group who'd been around the other side started heading off into the bush. He followed, using the clear confusion to help hide himself as he sprinted towards the trees like the rest of them. He wasn't sure what was going on, but if his twink was going into those trees, he was as well. Wait, Justin nearly pulled himself up on the thought. This wasn't about the twink. It was about knowing what he was getting himself into and what was happening around him, but mostly it was about extraction, because he was there to take Jex back to his father, not to protect anyone. Swallowing a lump, he hoped it was from a bug flying into his open mouth and not from the fact that he'd lied to himself. Justin disappeared into the shrubs and hoped like hell he didn't get lost. Trees and wildlife weren't his forte. He wasn't known for outback jobs or any that didn't have high rises or suburbs. He grew up on the outskirts of an inner city, and that was where he shined. Yet here he was. Branches slapped at him, tangling in his feet, frustrating him as he continually got lost. If it wasn't for the heavy breathing and the calls of men, Justin wasn't sure he'd have ever found his way in the thick bush. He was so out of his element, and as a result he felt like a fool. Yet, as soon as he saw his destination, everything crystallized. His twink was in trouble. To be fair, they probably all were, but all Justin saw was a threat, and all he knew was that something of his was there and no way in. Fucking hell, he'd let his kid be hurt before he even got a name. Hell, he wouldn't let the kid get hurt once he finally got it, but that was something he didn't particularly want to think about. Pulling up his rifle, Justin got to the edging of the trees. A quaint little cottage sat in the middle, reminding him of sweet things he'd only ever seen in kids' books. Men were yelling while some were pulling up guns of their own, shooting. 2 were already down and one was well on its way. Then a guy moved and Justin's eyes narrowed in on him. He let his breath slide out of himself as he focused in on the loose cannon that was, very clearly, getting ready to grab hold of one of the men his twink hung around. He let his finger squeeze. The shot rolled out of the barrel, recoiling the butt of the rifle into his shoulder as it went flying forward. Justin was ready for the backswing and let his body roll with it all, just like every other time. He was the gun and the gun was him. Justin didn't pull in air until he saw the shot hit its mark. He never had before, and he definitely wasn't going to change now. The bullet slid into the male's head. Luckily for the guy he'd saved, they'd managed to get the door at least 90% closed before this happened, which would make his cleanup a shitload easier. Washing blood and brain matter off a door was much nicer than out of carpet. His mind satisfied, he looked around, noting all the dead as he let his lungs fill up with air. His mind coming out of the clear spot it went into when shooting. It took no more than a nanosecond for his mind to click back on, but even in that time he needed a blink or two in order to focus. The area around him had gone still. Not just still in the way of startled animals in the dead, but in that creepy way when everyone holds their breath and looks at you like you have 4 heads and your cock hanging out your. Chapter 2. Fuck, Jex spat out. His hand came up, a dark handgun shining in the moonlight as he pointed it at Justin. Justin put up his free hand. Whoa mate, hold up. There was no way he was dropping his rifle, but he didn't want to look threatening. Jex's eyes narrowed. Justin could sense hatred spilling across the land toward him, but then again, it wasn't as if he was expecting anything different. "Jex?" Matt asked, looking from his lover to Justin and back again. "I'm not going back," Jex stated. "Back?" Matt blinked as he turned his head back to Justin, and it seemed to him that things clicked. "Kill him then." Justin smiled. He couldn't help it. The boys were definitely heading for greatness if they realized what they were saying. Then he remembered the clearing where it looked as if an animal had slaughtered all the men who had been trying to ransom off Jex to his father. He'd seen the cabin both Jex and his lover had clearly stayed the night in, and he'd seen he'd helped clean up the mess the two boys made as they took what they wanted. Freedom. Justin knew both of them were clearly willing to do everything they could to stay away from Jex's father. Jex didn't want the life his old man wanted him to become a part of, and unfortunately the only way to win against fire was to learn how to light the fuckers yourself. The fallout from it all was the old man had been overly proud of his only son. A voice came out of the blue. No. A soft voice that was almost missed but wasn't. He knew the sound came from his twink. He wasn't sure why he was shouting, not without taking his attention off Jex and Matt and their need to survive because, unlike him, they were doing what they needed to and not because they liked it. Hell, maybe Jex didn't really see much difference between a dead man and a live one. Maybe he thought killing was the only way to play, but surely Matt grew up in a place of jails and cops, so there was no way he'd be up for killing if he could see another way out. "He needs to die," Jex yelled back, breaking down in a way Justin hadn't thought he was capable of. "I won't go back. I won't." Justin surprised himself by saying, "No one said you had to." "What?" Matt this time seemed to be a little more composed, but then he really didn't understand the significance of Justin being there, at least not like Jex had. "No," Jex said, his head shaking slightly. Justin knew right then that he was a dead man living on borrowed time, but then he'd been living like that since he was 15 and ended up being saved by Jex's father himself and brought into the life he lived now. It was strange the things one thought of when clear death was on the menu. "No," Jex yelled again. A tremble ran across that one word. It spoke of tears and remorse and guilt and a shitload of need. Jex needed to live. He needed Justin dead. He needed not to be taken back to a world where he clearly understood he'd lose everything he was part of. Jex was not his father, no matter how easily he was able to pull a trigger. Justin had known this for a while now. He'd lose himself in a way he never wanted to. He clearly wanted to be here. Loved. The gun fired a loud scream in Justin's ears. It wasn't until he realized he hadn't taken a bullet that he knew the scream hadn't come from the gun, but from his twink. Pain spiked into his chest high up. The pain was a weird type of sting that Justin found himself brushing aside as he dropped his rifle and went to the little guy. He felt fierce emotions pull him to the boy for the first time in his life. His chest heaving against cloth. He seemed to be sobbing at the sight in front of him, but nothing came out of his eyes or mouth. He was better than that. Even if he didn't understand why it felt as if he was about to lose a long-time lover instead of a man he didn't even know the name of. His twink had rolled onto his back. He seemed to twitch as blood darkened his shirt in the same spot Justin hurt. "Fucking hell, Adam!" Matt was nearly screaming over the top of Jex's shoulder, holding his man in a tight embrace. "Adam!" Adam's plump lips parted. A little blood on the corner of his mouth. He smiled, more a grimace of pain but clearly trying to smile. "I know you." Then his glassy eyes fluttered closed. 1 minute 38 seconds earlier. Adam loved running, his legs pumping under him, his arms swinging and his chest puffing. It would have been nicer if he hadn't been trying to get somewhere, and that meant keeping up with men whose legs were twice as long as his. He was sure if anyone were filming this, he'd look like a little kid trying to keep up with his parents. He finally reached the clearing, but not before grunts and shouts sounded. Adam wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. How could he help? Jump in with fist and feet? He'd never gotten the hang of fighting, either playfully or for keeps. He'd always shied away from the violence of it all. Rubbing his hands on his thigh, he looked around, his eyes catching the attention of a lovely little cottage. The wind kicked up around him, making it seem like a different place. Flowers glittered in the moonlight as a spotlight of rays hit the front of the cottage. Ivy laced up the sides of the door, with moss helping conceal it, turning it into something out of a fairy tale. Adam's mouth watered, his heart pumped harder, his palms started sweating. He looked around the clearing. Chaos met his eyes, ruining that moment of perfection with hate and violence. Adam shied away from it, wanting to turn and run, but he couldn't leave his mates there, couldn't leave his family. He shifted position, unsettled. He wanted to do something to help, but he wasn't sure what to do. What was he supposed to do? There was a rustle near him, just to one side, not as close as it should have been when Adam finally turned in that direction, making sure no one was coming behind them. His whole body hitched from the sight. Home. Adam's throat closed, finding it impossible to get air. His chest ached, bones cracking, trying to realign themselves, but the moon wasn't there yet, so he didn't have enough power to shift him completely. His feet took him forward as the gun lowered off the man's shoulder. Adam wasn't sure whom he'd hit. Friend or foe, he didn't care. His whole world stood in front of him, and he wasn't stupid enough to let him go over a technicality. Craig had been a hunter, Adam thought, and they all loved him. Sounds vibrated around him, talking, yelling really back and forth, one side harsher and then the other. He wasn't sure what was going on, and he couldn't give a shit, not when his mate stood in front of him. Adrenaline had Adam's body shaking, but he couldn't seem to move, couldn't do anything but watch as his mate listened. Nothing shifted. Nothing stirred in him as he waited for movement, waiting for his mate to give him a clue what was happening. Adam scanned the area. He couldn't seem to stop it. He needed to know what had his mate so worked up. His eyes skirted on bodies, blood, and people standing around watching the same thing he was, but unlike him, they seemed to understand what the hell was going on. Brad looked as if he was on the verge of jumping in. Adam was more than sure he would have already, if it wasn't for the grip Kyle had on Brad's shoulders. Like anyone in this situation, Adam looked towards the action. Matt was the first one he saw. Tall and lean, he was standing there just on one side of Jex, and his hand lightly on his mate's. His face turned towards Adam's mate and back to his own. "I'm not going back," Jex said, his face ashen, his eyes wide, panicked. "Back?" Matt blinked. Then his head turned away, looking at Jex. He heard something click. Something that cramped up Adam's stomach so hard. Bile pushed up into his throat. Hot acid licked at his tonsils, his mouth started watering, gagging, needing to spit up what he was tasting. Jex's hand was stretched out, his fingers tight around the base. His gun was unsteady. In a way, that wasn't Jex. The man's face was in peril. For the first time in the history of Adam knowing Jex, and he knew it wasn't a long time, but the whole time the man hadn't flinched, not at anything, not for 1 minute. Now he was standing there, his face, his body scared, shitless as a man could get without pissing himself, and a gun pointing at Adam's mate. "No!" Adam screamed, startling himself, and yet he was more than sure most of the noise he made was inside his head, as no one came near him. No one even seemed to look. There was a twitch to his mate, though. Had he heard? Was he as tuned into Adam as Adam was to him? He had to be. That was what it meant, wasn't it? To have a mate, to be standing this close to the person you intended to spend the rest of your life with. That had to be heady, and it had to be affecting his mate as much as it was Adam. Adam knew it did. "He needs to die," Jex yelled. The words slapped across Adam's face. His heart exploded in his chest as everything he knew and would know rumbled down to a few words. "He needs to die" rang in his ears repeatedly, the tune that didn't make sense but held Adam's whole life. He needs to die. Adam's chest hurt, but he was too distressed to understand he needed to suck in air. The hair along his back spiked up. His leg muscles shifted, moving in a way they shouldn't, not in his human body. The tops of his fingers shifted to claws as hair grew thicker across their tops and up his forearms. The summer breeze caressed them, telling him things Adam couldn't even begin to understand. He rolled forward onto the balls of his feet as his knees ached, wanting something that just wasn't possible. Adam growled, a little sound that caught in his throat, but made him draw in a breath, easing one ache and bringing about another. Adam didn't think. All he heard ringing in his head was a song of death and a gun pointing at his mate. A mate that he'd been waiting for since he'd learned he'd get one. A mate that was going to love him like no one else would love him. He would be someone who would treasure him as if he was something special and not just another mouth to feed. He wanted someone to be his family, his lover, his other half, so that he could prove them all wrong. He was worth a lover and worth a family. He was worth so much more than those arseholes had said. He was. He had to be, because if they were right, if he wasn't worthy of one person to love him over everything else in the world, then he might as well not bother waking up in the morning. The wind shifted. At least that was what it felt like to Adam right before. Something ran into him hard and hot. It saturated his right shoulder in pain. So much pain rolled around his mind, as his body seemed to cringe in on itself, wanting away from it as fast as possible. Adam tasted dirt as he licked his lips. He wasn't sure how that happened, but apparently he was on the ground, face first in the dirt. Fucking great. Pushing up with his left arm, Adam gritted his teeth around a scream of pain. As he rolled himself onto his back, hitting the ground hard, he felt as if someone decided to stab fire-heated knives along his spine. Or they'd not bothered with that time-consuming act and just put a fire pit next to him that Adam had managed to roll into. His mouth was dry, making him swallow several times, trying to get his lips wet, but it wasn't helping. He needed liquid. He needed painkillers. What he really needed was to pass out, because he hurt so fucking much. Warmth saturated him, cuddling around him, settling him like nothing else could. The only thing he could smell or simply care about at this moment. Cracking his eyes open, Adam looked up at his mate. He was on his knees by Adam's side and looking as sick as Adam felt before all the pain started. His arm was up over his chest, hand wrapped around his right shoulder as if he was holding on to something. He was a fair bit older than them, Adam suddenly realized. The guy's face appeared to be a frown, the wrinkles in his forehead and in the corners of his eyes aging him. His brown hair, clean-cut, averaged to a point that Adam felt he must had dressed himself to look that way. All Adam saw was perfection. All he saw was home. Mate, I know you, he breathed out, needing to talk, and apparently that was all he could say. Chapter 3. Pain radiated across his shoulder and back. Adam tried to breathe through the ache as he thought about the idea of shifting into a more comfortable position. He wasn't sure if moving would cause his stomach to roll out his mouth, or had he settled enough. It was just the after effects of when they'd moved him the first time, when he'd passed out as they'd lifted him off the ground, but not before he vomited a little, according to the taste in his mouth. Fucking hell, Jax. Shut up. Shit fucking happens every fucking day, so deal with it and move on. The voice spoke gently, mutely, close. So close as if it came from someone leaning against the back of the lounge he lay on. Fathom wished to think he would place the man his mate had to be, though he didn't recognize the voice. With his arse braced on the edge, his legs crossed, maybe along with his arms, still looking like he didn't give a shit about anything. Yet there he stood, watching, waiting, making sure Adam was safe and sound. His mate. Adam took in a slow breath, relaxing into the moment of wonder and peace and understanding where he stood, finally, after a lifetime of never quite figuring it out. But what the fuck, mate? You were born in a fucking princess castle. A loving mother doting on your arse. You know it ain't your fault. The kid threw himself in front of a bullet. What could you do? Change its fucking direction while it was moving? Hey now, why don't we all calm down? Eamon's voice seemed to roll through the house, through Adam's every nerve. Eamon always had that effect on him, and the others he knew, but definitely on him. Shelter, trust, and forgiveness. I am calm, his mate said, calm as rain. Jex, on the other hand, needs his arse handed to him so he'll stop crying like a fucking bitch. Seriously, mate, Matt said. Adam smiled. Clearly Matt was at the end of his limit. You need to watch your mouth. And what are you gonna do if I don't, mate? Stand there while I splatter your brains all over this pretty little house? You got no idea who you're up against. Not where I'm concerned, his mate countered. And who am I up against? A hired killer? Matt spat back. Then there was silence. It was a saying, apparently it was the reality of the moment. Adam wanted to sit up. He wanted to see what was on his mate's face. He just wanted to stare at it for a bit, but the idea of what emotion would be lacking, especially when dealing with people he didn't know, scared the shit out of Adam a little. Fuck, Matt yelled. Fucking killer in this house. He mumbled the words, tickling at Adam's ears. See, Eamon? We should have fucking killed him when we had the chance. Adam shot up. No. The world tilting sideways had him bracing himself, his fingers curling around the top of the lounge. The head rush didn't stop him from pulling himself up, trying to get over the top of the lounge. He tried to get between everyone else and his mate. He needed to protect his mate. Lie back down, Adam's mate snapped at him, his hands solid and soft on him. Heat pooled from those 2 points of contact and rolled around his blood stream, heating him up, making him want. Don't fucking talk to him like that. Kyle's voice was like a slap or more. Like spritz of ice-cold water pumping on him, like he was a dog humping his owner's leg. Like what? Like I give a shit if he fucking hurt himself for no good bloody reason, his mate said as he gently placed Adam back onto the lounge where he had been. That's enough, Eamon said in his alpha voice, as Adam liked to call it. The others just called him the boss. Adam, lie back down. We don't want you hurt any more than you already are. Matt, you need to close your mouth. You're starting to worry me with all this calling for death. Don't we remember where Craig came from? What about Jex? Clearly the connection there means something important for you to call for the death of another man's mate just so you don't have to deal with what's following you. Eamon slowly shook his head, before ending with, you really want to be that man? More silence. At least, Adam hoped it was silence and not him losing his hearing as he breathed in deep. Laying back down hurt more than getting up. And his head still didn't want to play nice. At least his stomach was still. His head didn't throb. He just didn't want to have to deal with the facts of being awake or moving too much. Overall, he seemed to be a lot better than he thought he should be after being shot. He'd been shot. Shot. Like a bullet had slammed into his shoulder. Adam guessed he should have been grateful it had only been his shoulder, but then he'd not really thought about the fact that he was putting himself in front of a bullet. A bullet. Shot. His throat blocked open, blocked a hiccup of oxygen allowed in at one time. It wasn't enough. Not enough. Shot. He could have died. He could have died and hurt so many people. He took shot. Hands shook him lightly, so lightly Adam could hardly feel it. Voices sounded around him, but they just rolled into the flow of his own voice. Blackness overtook his vision yet again, but this time he wasn't seeing it. He didn't have that much space inside his head. He didn't have any space in there. Nothing. There was nothing, nothing. Nothing. His chest shuddered, trying to pull in more air, but it couldn't get past his throat. Didn't. Adam tried to move. He needed to move to get some space, to get some air, but he couldn't. Hands held him down, keeping him still, trying to tell him something, but he couldn't understand anything. Rope tightened around his shoulders, his elbows, his middle scraping against his skin, keeping him still, making sure he couldn't get away. He screamed, but nothing came out. He couldn't hear himself. Couldn't get the words out of his mouth. Couldn't get the sound outside his head. Stop. The voice rang against the insides, hitting all corners. It was the only thing he could hear, and the only thing making sense, and it seemed to grip his shoulders and make Adam look at him. Blackness was still his world, but there was something settling against him. Soft cotton packed his ears as silk rubbed against his heated flesh. Breath. The voice was different now. He breathed. Things settled quickly from there. At least it felt that way to Adam. Darkness stayed until he blinked, and then everything snapped back to normal. Heat splashed at his cheeks. He didn't understand why, except that Eamon was leaning over him, his hands on his shoulders. His mate was a shadow above him. Adam tried not to look at him, but couldn't make himself stop. Concerned brows looked down at him, eyes that held a hint of worry. Yeah. Maybe Adam didn't know him for long or at all, but he knew people, and he understood a worried person when he saw one. The idea he'd had a breakdown in front of his mate was humiliating. Didn't inspire a whole lot of anything, least of all strength. However, the concern on his mate's face, though it didn't lessen his embarrassment, did seem to make his chest puff up as the cavity filled. Justin, can you please get Adam a drink? Eamon asked the man behind him, though Adam made that assumption from process of elimination. Sure thing, document. Adam's mate Justin, fuck him raw. His mate's name was Justin, and he cared. And he felt, and he was right there doing something to help Adam out. Adam sighed into the cushion under him, not caring about the fact that Eamon still held him, still watched, waiting for something major to happen. Didn't care about the many number of things. He'd happily make a fool of himself, repeatedly, if that was the only way he'd see that look on Justin's face. Here, Justin said. His voice caressed Adam, licking against the sensitive skin, making him want more and need deeper. Eamon had eased away from Adam, most likely when he'd seen Justin close in on the lounge, so Adam only had to reach up to take hold of the cup. Then, awkwardness happened as he held a cup above him without any way of drinking. Not the way he was lying, not unless he wanted to pour the contents over his face and see what hit. He shifted, trying to get himself into a different position to drink. His uninjured hand was holding the cup, the other one nearly crippled. His dominant hand made the tilting of a cup difficult, let alone trying to do so. When upside down, Justin chuckled softly as he held the cup, gripping it in his palm as his fingers trapped Adam's to the cool glass. Adam licked his lips, his eyes unable to break contact as arms and hands helped him sit up so he was able to drink and feel a little less helpless. "Hi," he whispered as those fingers let him loose, and his lips wet from a sip of water, all without looking away. "I'm Adam." Justin smiled, his lips slimming a little as they stayed together, his eyes sparkling with laughter. "Justin." They shared a moment, one of those moments that was all squishy and mushy and had him wanting to throw it all away as he stripped them both down and straddled Justin's lap. "And with that, gentlemen, it's time for bed," Eamon said, clapping his hands. And unlike the first time he'd pulled out of his breakdown, he didn't feel the need to blush, even though clearly everyone in the room was having a bit of a laugh at him. "We all staying here?" Matt asked from over near the dining table. "I think it's for the best," Eamon said with a nod, before he leant down and whispered something in Chris' ear. It took everything in Adam to block out those words. Some things he didn't need to know, and as close as both men were standing, he'd have heard. "Where we all gonna fit?" Matt asked, clearly wanting to get to bed fast. "You and Jex can have my room," Adam told Matt, the words popping out of his mouth without thought. It wasn't as if he stayed in there much anyway. "Thanks, Adam," Jex said, standing up, grabbing hold of Matt's arm and pulling him to his feet. "Let it go, babe." His voice sounded lighter, almost as if he was having a laugh at something. "How can I?" Matt asked as Jex walked them up the stairs. "Remind me to get them to change the sheets," Adam muttered as he settled his head on the back of the lounge, his eyes caressing Justin's. "You hide your loot?" Kyle asked with a laugh. Adam's head came up in panic. "Shit, no. Go save it for me, Kyle, please." He looked at his buddy with puppy eyes and fluttering lashes. Kyle laughed harder. "That look ain't worked on me in years, buddy. Ask your mate to get it for you." Adam turned to face Justin, trying his hardest to act as if what Kyle said was nothing more than the term and not the werewolf meaning. "Would ya?" Justin stared at Adam for a long moment before he sighed. "Where am I headin'?" Adam tried not to grin in triumph. "Up the stairs, second on the right." "Really? It's the one Jex and Matt are about to start fucking in," Colin said, as Justin got up off the lounge. "They wouldn't have closed the door yet." "Yet." That came from Tim. Adam had forgotten they were even there, sitting at the dining table. "I didn't know they knew the meaning." Chapter 5. Fire. The voice moved further away from the door, but Justin could hear it just as strongly as if the man was standing right next to him. He was sure the person yelling was Phil. Rolling Adam off him, Justin sprang into action. His pants went up his legs, and his shirt was in his hand as he opened the door, looking back to make sure. "Adam." "What?" He wasn't sure, but he had to check, and though his heart did a slight jump at the fact that Adam's sweats were already up against his hip, he wasn't sure what that feeling actually meant. Opening the door, Justin went to see what was going on. It was something else. That was suddenly new. Though he was never one to miss what was going on in a house he was staying at, this time there was something different. This time he actually cared. Running down the stairs, Justin was just in time to see Eamon and Chris rush down the hall. Eamon only wore a pair of worn leather pants, while Chris had on sweats along with thick fancy leather cuffs wrapped around both wrists. Justin noticed that Chris also had a cuff around one of his ankles, but was sure he had them on both ankles, his left leg being caught up in the fabric. Coming into the lounge room, Justin got a little sidetracked by Craig. Not only did he have a weapon in his hand, but he looked as if he was about to hand one of Justin's back to him. Justin's brows rose in question with a jerky movement that he couldn't interpret as anything other than take this. This left him to fight or shrug off the moment, so he took the weapon. At least this way he'd get his gun back and feel like he held some solid ground. Tucking the Glock into the back of his jeans, trying not to shudder from the fact that he was sliding the barrel of a gun against his arse. Hell, he was settling the tip into the top of his arse crack. The cold metal scrape had an odd soothing quality to it, something that he couldn't hide from himself even with the horror and risks of carrying a loaded gun that way. The heavy weight of the weapon pulled at his pants and made it feel as if it was going to fall out at any moment. If he'd ever held a gun this way, it had been a long time ago. He ended up being one of the last people out the door. Craig was still fiddling with something before joining them on the front landing. First thing Justin did was look around. The front light wasn't on. Instead, light was spilling from inside, lighting up the men standing around just enough for Justin to see them. Most of the larger men stood around Eamon. Justin wasn't sure if they realized what they were doing or if it was unintentional or instinctual, but he saw it as protecting their boss, because the way they stood, there was no way anyone was going to be able to off Eamon, at least not without hitting another man first. The night sky flashed with lights. They were the emergency type that only lit up the area it touched for those brief minutes, leaving everything else in complete darkness. There was no wind, perfect sniper weather. He only wished that thought didn't make his finger twitch for his binoculars. On instinct, Justin looked towards his car. "Fuck me," he breathed out. He felt his legs move him towards his car, which was hidden behind light and water and noise and smoke. "Sorry, mate," Craig said as his hand hit hard against his back, then disappeared. Justin slowly shook his head, completely stupefied by what he was seeing. His car had been set on fire. He probably should have hidden it better, but a hick town with men who didn't know squat. Okay, that probably wasn't fair. Justin had been slack in his surveillance. Fucking hell. He looked around. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to think it, didn't want to fucking feel it, but what the fuck, man? His car was on fire. His eyes danced around trying to work out all this bullshit as fast as he could, but for some reason it wasn't happening. Why wasn't it happening? Why was this fucking happening? "Justin," Adam said, his hand on his arm, callus scraping lightly against the hair. The novelty made him pause. A hot little man who actually gets his hands dirty. Big eyes stared at him as if he was something special, as if he hadn't spent his life killing. Justin swallowed. The kid had a crush on someone that didn't exist. It was there in his eyes, and he couldn't think of a thing to do but take what was offered, even if he knew he was destined to break the kid's heart. "What the fuck's going on?" Justin asked, because he needed to get away from those eyes and the reality that he wasn't good enough to be seen from them. There wasn't anything wrong with him. Justin's life was a reality he was lucky to have. He had money stashed away, saved for nothing except so that he'd never have to ask for anything if he ended up on the street. The only way he'd end up on the street was if he never went home, because if he did, without Jex, he wouldn't be needing any money, which was the fun side of working for a boss whose retirement plan entailed a short chain, cement, and a cheesy push off a pier. Or maybe it'd be easier and quicker just to start talking about the fishes. "That's not really any of your business," Brad said. He was the furthest from the group, just this side of the light from the house, nearly stepping into the flashing lights from the fire trucks. He was a cop. Justin didn't need to know what he did to see that. He could smell it on the fucker from a mile off, and that was behind a closed window, with his car full of gas. Brad was a cop, young and maybe a little naive, but there was definitely something there that wasn't in a lot of cops. Something that explained a lot. If only he knew what way he was meant to be looking to get a fucking clue. And there was a massive point here, right on this fucking patch of driveway. The point was driving Justin nuts as he sat back and took it all in, because none of it fucking mattered. Not their secret, not this little boy with a crush, and not his car and all his fucking weapons. Fuck. Heat boiled in his head as if acid was pumping out of his organs, making him want to rip at his skin and splash it all over everyone else so he could watch them all bubble and die with slow agony on the faces. Fingers squeezed tight on his arms. A soothing wash covered him, taking that heat, smothering it as if it never existed. "They're werewolves," Craig said out of the blue and into a reality that Justin didn't even want to think about. "Oh, okay." He nodded. Yeah, that was all he needed to deal with those fuckers again. Fuck again. One of the other guys laughed. It was a little off, but Justin thought the sound was supposed to make it look as if Craig was crazy. It didn't work, but just proved that everything was about to become real. Real. Justin wanted to laugh because werewolves were the most real fucking Things in the world. Slap sarcasm here, please. Okay. Adam asked at his side, his face looking as if he was waiting for an explosion. Too bad Justin wasn't that dramatic, and if it hadn't been for him killing a handful of them in his early 20s, he'd have still held his footing, because that was what he was taught to do. Run with it until you're proven right or kill them all. Hell, he'd been known to do both. Seen one before? Craig, the mouthpiece of this group, asked. Justin glanced around at the rest of them, all open-mouthed, shocked that a person would know what the hell was going on. Amateurs. Luckily for them, he wasn't that much of a con man. Huh. Apparently, Eamon had left the group along with Brad and Kyle. When did that happen? Shrugging off anything other than the ones that were still there, Justin flashed a quick look at Adam. He hated himself for needing to, even as he told himself he'd regret the look in Adam's eyes. Killed a few, he said, understanding why the look needed to happen because, as the words left his mouth, Justin did a lot to stop himself from reacting to Adam's gasp. Why did it hurt so much to prove to this little man reality was there even if he wanted to admit it or not? People weren't nice. They generally weren't loyal, and they definitely took what they wanted and left the trusting a rasp of flesh with nothing to fill their cores. Reality made a mockery of the innocence in people's hearts, and it hurt like hell to have to step into the light. However, Adam had started it, and Justin wasn't the type to hold back who he was. He just wondered how long the look of worship stayed in the other man's eyes, and why he wanted to treasure it until it disappeared. Reality was a bitch that Adam didn't want any part of, so when his mate talked about killing werewolves as if he was born to do it, he just shrugged it off. It wasn't that it didn't matter, but for the record, his mate was a killer. That had been established before he'd let the man fuck him. Adding werewolves just turned it all into what Craig did, and he came around. Hell, Craig was happier now that he was on their side, and Adam had to believe his mate would be the same. Who could live a life one kill at a time? Who could be happy to stay that way their whole life? Wasn't there a time that they all wanted to give up, give in, and live on an island away from everyone? Wasn't that what all those movies said? Wasn't that what it was all about? Waking up and realizing life held no meaning? Smiling up at his mate, Adam ran his fingers against the soft skin on the inner portion of Justin's forearm. Justin felt his toes shifting under him as his body lit up, wanting more than just that simple touch from Adam. At least you'll know what you're up against then, Craig said, talking the way he did when Dan had entered the room. It wasn't friendly, and yet there wasn't a whole heap of hostility, but rather more a guarded waiting. Adam could tell he didn't know what to expect, but still he was trying most probably for Adam's benefit. Yeah, stoked, man, Justin said in a way that told of eye rolling even if one were standing in a different state. Adam laughed, the mirth just up and puffed out of him as his fingers worked their way into the other man's elbow. He felt the shift of muscle and tendons as Justin rolled his arm out slightly, giving Adam more room. It might not have been the most important thing going on that night, but Adam's heart beat a little smoother behind his ribs from the knowledge that his mate wanted his touch. The heat helped, but all Adam really wanted was to get Justin behind a closed door. He didn't really give a shit if it locked or not. When Adam finally looked up into Justin's face, it was to find the other men looking down at him. The softness in his eyes had Adam swallowing hard around his tongue. He was only getting to see so much. Then Justin blinked and looked over Adam's shoulder, his face closing up again. What's the outcome? He asked whoever was behind them. Adam didn't really care. Not at this moment. Not when he was fighting down an uneasy wave of tears. Why he had the need, he didn't know. He should have been happy he was the only one getting to see tenderness from Justin, but instead there was something truly sad about him being so guarded, which hit at Adam hard. Lost it all, Eamon said, sounding sorry. You sure? Justin's body shifted away from Adam, but it wasn't as if he was getting away, or at least Adam hoped that wasn't what Justin wanted, but more like he was trying to see something even if there wasn't a chance in hell. Are they done with it? Yeah, tow truck's on the way. Shit. And off the man went. Okay then, Eamon said, looking puzzled and scratching his head as he gazed around at all of them. Kyle laughed. Seems like he didn't believe ya, boss. Or he knows something we don't, Craig put in. Clearly, Chris quipped. Ain't like there isn't a list on that count. The group laughed as they stood there waiting to see what the man was about to do. Fatigue hit hard at Adam through the weight as the excitement faded. His shoulders sagged, and all he wanted to do was sit down. Okay, so he probably wanted to lie in bed, but that seemed too far. So, one of you fuckers gonna help? Justin called out from the darkness. He seemed far away and right up close all at the same time. Adam assumed that was because of where the house sat on the property and the eerie quietness of the area now that the firemen had all pissed off. They all seemed to look over at Eamon. It was a reaction. It was instinct, and no matter how much Adam wanted Justin to be there with him, he wasn't one of them yet, and instinct had them needing to get a yes from the alpha to help. The lone wolf entered the pack. Chapter 6. Justin's eyes flashed open, his body tingling with a sense of something happening that shouldn't have been. He lay on the bed, Adam's head on his shoulder, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to everything, safe in Justin's arms. Justin's heart did something weird as the thought swept into his brain, and his breath hitched a little at the realization that he was making Adam feel that it wasn't a concept Justin wanted to look into, not the fact that up until then he'd been sleeping just as softly, just as easy in Adam's arms, knowing that he was safe and nothing was going to happen to the little guy. He would make sure nothing was going to happen because he was there, with Justin where he should be. It was almost as if Justin had been missing this one element, that the reasons he'd never been able to relax was because he wasn't protecting what was his. How could he have been, when Adam was someone he'd never met before? Now, though, he could breathe easy knowing that little else was important, and if trouble appeared, at least he knew where Adam was, knowing the kid was safe. His shoulders shifted hard. A shiver nearly moved him across the bed as something that would have felt like butterflies to anyone else twisted up his insides. His arms tightened around Adam as he rolled the other man over onto the other side of the bed. He whispered something about a bathroom to a man not quite waking up, but clearly noticing something was going on. Out of bed, Justin pulled on his jeans and picked up the gun Craig had given him. He wasn't sure if he'd need it. Honestly, Justin was hoping whatever he was feeling was coming from the house, due to the fact that he didn't know the layout, didn't know who was here, who wasn't, or if the others would be coming back. He quickly checked Adam's window. It was on the side of the house, looking out over the valley and trees. It was dark, just coming up to first light, the world holding a crispness Justin loved. It was when a second wind came, though. From a sudden cold snap right before the world righted itself again. The window was locked, but Justin double-checked it, and even if it wasn't, there was no way anyone would be getting into the house this way unless they had climbing equipment, and then what was the point? Adam had insisted that he sleep in his own bed when they'd gotten back in. He was exhausted and pushed to his limits from the people around him and the stupidity of thinking they could leave things alone and not killed. Justin had just wanted to lock himself in a room, but instead he'd fussed around and helped as Adam stripped his bedding and changed it all, right down to the quilt cover. It had been a weird moment as he shifted pillowcases around when he realized what he was doing, and that he'd not minded. He'd catered to someone else's request when there hadn't been a reason to, and he'd done it with a smile and jokes. He then stripped down and crawled into bed, where he closed his eyes and relaxed as he'd never done before. Though what was truly scary was the fact that when Adam joined him, he'd rolled the little guy over his body, making sure he was away from any threat, pulling him in close and settled in for the night. He'd never felt the need to cuddle once in his life, even though he'd slept in countless men's bed. He'd never cared about them, not like he was realizing he cared for Adam, and that should have scared the shit out of him, but it didn't. Shirt and shoes in hand, Justin left the room, making sure he didn't disturb the sleeping man. It wouldn't do Adam any good to expect Justin back. He didn't put his shoes on until he'd reached the steps and gone down a few. The feeling in his stomach was getting worse, especially as he learnt the house was still, everyone clearly asleep. Not a sound, not even from the places he expected to find them. Gun in reach on the step, Justin pulled the shirt over his head as he slipped one shoe on, and then bent to fix it up as he slipped on the second. When he was done, he got his gun ready. Something didn't feel right, and he didn't have a clue what. However, he had been in this spot before. Something was about to happen. It was amazing how many times running and swinging was actually the better option, where sometimes waiting around failed. This wasn't one of those moments, but he'd not been watching. He'd not been caring. about the outside world, and because of that, he didn't know which direction to look or how long he'd been feeling this way before it got intense enough to coax him away from his lover. Not knowing what he was about to run into wasn't an experience he liked, but shit happened all the time, and no matter how much you watched, you couldn't see everything. This was one of those times, and he needed to stop bitching and moaning and start figuring out what he was going to do. Going into the front area of the house made his feet falter. He wanted to turn around and run back upstairs to make sure Adam was okay, but that was stupid. Adam was fine. Everything was fine. Straightening up, Justin realized just how true that thought was. Everything was fine. There wasn't a light on, nothing but a slight sparkle of outside light pouring in through the sliding door leading out to a deep veranda. Taking a long look around, he quickly checked to make sure someone had locked the doors before heading towards the laundry that just happened to be in the basement, which was a novelty in itself. The strangeness of it came from the fact that the door was hidden to look like a hall cupboard, and if Justin hadn't helped carry in his weapons down there after getting them from his hot, charred car, he'd not have known it existed. Closing the door softly behind him, he wondered briefly what the family who'd built the house was expecting when they made the basement. Not only was it all concrete and heavy wood, but the door itself had a crossbolt, and Justin was more than sure a wooden wall pulled out across the whole top step. Downstairs was a vast empty space, easily as big as the rest of the house, or at least the first floor, and clearly able to set up a lot of people for a short time or a small family for a long time. As it was, the floors held bags, boxes, and crates of what Justin gathered were Craig's weapons. There wasn't anything that told him that except the fact that when they'd put all of his stuff down here, one couldn't tell where his started and Craig's began. On the far side was the laundry, holding that same effect as the top of the stairs, as if something could come out and block the entrance. Justin got that idea from the small groove cut into the flooring just in front of it. The design hadn't been hidden, but just put away until it was needed. Grabbing the bag he needed, he strapped himself up, and taking the key off the hook outside the laundry door, he slipped out, locking it up behind him. He wasn't really worried, but he didn't want to give anyone an advantage, especially because if Justin was on the outside wanting to get in, that was definitely the door he'd try first. It was facing the backyard and stood under the shadow of the veranda. No one was going to see him, not unless the person stood looking at the door itself. After the lock engaged, Justin did what he did best. He disappeared into the underbrush and went to see what had his guts in knots. The body hit the deck first, making a solid thud on the wood as Justin continued up the stair behind him. The guy grunted, panting as he tried to scurry away from him. Justin took his time. He was in a particular mood, playing with a person marked for death, and he didn't want to say it was his specialty, mostly because he didn't actually like being this person who killed. It was just necessity. Justin had even come up with a character version of himself for just these moments, one that liked the torture, like that panicked look in their eyes as they realized death was on the horizon, and yet they couldn't stop hoping they'd be able to get out of it, that they'd be alive at the end. This guy, however, didn't have that look. Yeah, he wanted to get away. He didn't want to be there, but it seemed more like he was playing up an instinct he didn't have. Justin wasn't really sure why, but it seemed to make the guy feel better to try and play games with Justin, so he let him. It wasn't the man's fault. Justin had watched him and two others for over an hour listening. As they bitched about the horribleness of surveillance, they spoke big words before Justin circled back to the house and decided to take a jog. It wasn't really the man's fault that Justin had made the decision after learning they were heading back to the boss, then had clearly marked the time he needed before they gave a shit one way or another about this lone man. It wasn't truly his fault that the guy had fallen for his stupidity, even though he'd clearly come out of a house that held a hunter. Then again, big men who hunted big game really weren't bright, and they didn't need to be, because they weren't hunting anything that could think. At least that was what Justin had learnt in his time on his job. He honestly thought it was harder to kill an animal than it was a person. He'd always taken the analogy that it was easier to pick off sheep. Hell, you could do that in your own backyard when surrounded by other sheep. People liked to believe they were smarter than they were. Of course, most realized bullshit when they saw it, and for those million, they had nothing to worry about. It was the sheep, the followers of the world, who needed something to sit behind. They needed an idea. It wasn't always their fault that the idea they chose to pursue was the one getting them killed. Yeah, he might be jaded, but then what else was he supposed to be when he'd only ever been introduced to two kinds, the ones that led the sheep and eventually started believing their own cast iron bullshit, and the sheep themselves. So are you ready to talk? Justin asked the beaten man. He wasn't bad off, though Justin hadn't been kind to him as he dragged him through the shrubs and trees and then over the long line of grass. Fuck off, fag, he spat out. The words were flung at Justin, and if he'd given a shit what anyone thought, they might have stuck. As it was, they were only words he'd heard thousands of times before, spoken by wankers worried their cocks might just be like what they were seeing. Crouching down, Justin used his eyes and lips to get the over-the-top flirt look on his face, the one that he'd used to snag many a man in his time, the one that didn't waste fucking time but got down to the point. Running fingers down the hunter's cheek, he fluttered, licking his bottom lip. Are you sure? The guy flipped, pushing himself back so fast and with such strength that he ended up smacking his head against the railing of the porch while spouting a shitload of noise Justin was sure were words. The sliding door sounded behind him. Justin wasn't sure what had taken the bastards so long to come out since he knew they were up. He'd seen Adam wake, looking around frantically as he searched for Justin, and then sit at the dining table and talk to someone out of view with sadness in his body language. Justin didn't like that look. He didn't like that he'd made Adam feel like that, but there wasn't anything he could have done about it without everyone seeing him and asking questions he didn't know the answer to yet. The sliding door did what it did best by opening up and letting a spill of just awakened males shuffle their way onto the deck, the smell of coffee flowing before them, making Justin's mouth water and his gut growl. Hello, Tony. Craig's voice was colder than Justin had ever heard it, even when he'd first rocked up. Pussy faggot, the man named Tony spat out, venom laced every syllable, matching the hatred spilling from his eyes. That was always your problem, wasn't it? Wanted but never had a chance, Craig said with a cool tone. The man spat out more words. Apparently he'd learned to be closed-lipped about everything except his sexuality, which in Justin's opinion spoke more about an internal debate than what anyone on the outside said. Clearly the man didn't want to be seen, thought of, or shared in a joke that questioned his liking of vagina. Justin smiled. It wasn't a nice smile, and as expected, got his old pal Tony's mouth muttering shit that wasn't respectful, and quite frankly Justin didn't want to hear. He ain't gonna tell us anything, Craig told him. I gathered, was Justin's only reply. He knew it was a bad idea to bring the man up here, but something hadn't allowed him just to shoot them all. Something was holding his trigger finger back and he didn't have the time to ponder why while he'd been tying down the fuckers. Should I just kill him then? Justin asked as he pulled his gun out of the holster at the small of his back. Quick fingers and easy movements and it was ready and aiming. Probably not here, Craig said over his shoulder as he got to his feet, dragging Tony with him by his collar. Don't want the hassle of getting blood out of the wood. Justin looked down at the dark red wood. Its perfection spoke of refurbishing. Makes sense. Justin swooped down and grabbed Tony by the back of the legs, and with a little help from Craig, tipped the fucker over the end. Both stood for a moment watching as the guy tumbled down, hitting the ground with a thud and a heavy moan. It didn't take long for him to get onto his feet. He was one of Craig's people, and Craig had given him a brief explanation of what he used to be. Justin took his time putting his handgun back into the holster before pulling another out from under his arms. He then unclipped his silencer and twirled it onto the end as they both stood there watching the guy hobble off towards the tree. Taking aim, Justin let go of everything but the metal in his hands and air between him and his victim, then licked his lips and pulled the trigger. There was a sharp recoil and a soft sound. Justin stayed with the bullet as it whirled itself across the air, eating up the distance in seconds before sliding softly into the running man's skull and exploding out the other. Chapter 7. His mate was a killer. There it rang again inside Adam's head as he watched Justin and Craig trot down the veranda stairs and quickly deal with a body, and by deal he meant dragging the body over to an already burnt-out area before pulling out the leftover branches that hadn't quite disintegrated and covering the body with that, then grabbing some green stuff and piling that on top. Then flames. It lit quickly and efficiently, and smelt of a bush fire within minutes. His mate was a killer, Adam thought again as he descended the stair with everyone else walking as a group in silence over to the two men standing watching the fire destroy the body. Again and again his mind sang the tune his mate was a killer. Yet, might have been trying to get him to truly see what he should already know. Especially now, with an actual body right there burning away a secret no one present would tell. Adam's mate was a killer. That mouthful of reality tasted sour as he tried to work out why it wasn't bothering him. Was he suicidal? Was he a little girl in her rebellion streak? No, he was trusting. Chris was always going on and on about that and what he saw and how he dealt with the world at large. What shocked Adam wasn't the fact his mate was a killer. He'd known that. Just happened to be the first time he'd seen it. He'd seen that cold look on Justin's face and the mechanics of his body as he played and then took down his target. He hadn't heard what the men had said, at least not what Craig and Justin had said. He'd turned his ears from the spewing hatred, but it all hit too close to home for him to ignore it completely. So was that what was getting at him? Not that his mate killed a man, but that something in Adam had been satisfied to have it all stop, to have someone who spat hatred at others for no reason be killed, ended like they all should be? Was that it? A wish and prayer he'd been trying to get someone to hear. Finally played out by a man Adam saw as his protection in life, as his one good thing that would turn the world upside down for him. The protector part might have been true, but the rest not so much. Even if he wished he were that sort of man, he wasn't. He didn't believe in killing, nor did he wish he could say people deserved what they got. No, it seemed the better answer was that Adam didn't want to see Justin as anything but the man he would spend the rest of his life with, and because he didn't see the importance of losing his someone special over the enemy, he let everything else fall away and stepped up next to that very man. This close to the only person in Adam's world, he could hear the moon's seduction beckoning him, prickling up the hairs on his arms and thighs, wanting him to change, but it wasn't strong enough. He howled, wanting out as the human trapped him in a cage of skin, tissue, ligaments, and bones. His other half was in strong agreement. They'd do anything to be with Justin. And to start, that everything from Justin's past had to be forgiven, not forgotten, but left to the past where it belonged. They were together, and it didn't matter what happened. This was where Adam needed to be. This was where he wanted to be. It's not that easy, mate. Craig was staying off to one side. The fear of talking himself out of, then into a relationship started trickling away, and the world outside him started making sense. Why the fuck not? Justin's voice was low and deadly serious, to the point that one could hear the need for blood under each word. Adam had taken a second in the early moments of his pain to consider that Justin was like Jex, that cold, almost detached personality. However, Justin was nothing like Jex. He held life under all his calm, a clam that he would show. It made Adam want to smile. Even though he had no problem being the only person to see emotion from the man he loved, it was nice to realize his mate might be a person to be proud of him and to show the world that. Because we don't want to put our lovers in harm's way, Matt snapped at him. That's why. Justin's eyes narrowed. Because stepping back and letting shit go is really helping to protect them. His lip lifted up in clear disgust. You leave yourself open to being picked off. They only come at us once a month. So far. But it looks to me that the numbers are dwindling, and you know what men like that do when they feel they're about to fucking lose. He turned dramatically and pointed as he looked down at the burning body. What if they'd had the balls to start shooting? Or if they'd lit the house on fire last night? But they don't. Matt snapped. To Adam, it seemed like Matt was saying that on principle, not about the point being made, because he was making a fucking good one. Adam could tell, not only from his position, but because Craig had started to think. His hands on his hips, his stance wide, ready for anything as his eyes seemed to focus on one single point. Yet, Jex said, his hand on Matt's back. Adam was sure Jex's fingers were quickly tucked into his mate's jeans. He'd seen Jex do that multiple times, mostly when he'd become the center of attention, when everyone turned their eyes onto him. This time, though, it seemed more about relaxing Matt, making sure his mate knew he was with him, even as he disagreed. What the fuck, Jex? You can't honestly say he's here to make things all fucking better. Course not, but out of us all, who knows crazed killers better than that man? Jex pointed, clearly meaning Justin was one. Fuck. Adam looked over at Justin, and it wasn't hard. He hadn't been able to take his mind off the man since he first laid eyes on him, but there was definitely something in actually looking for the sake of looking because he was allowed to. Justin took that moment to laugh. It rattled up Adam's spine, making him want to squirm, to move away, closer to his mate, giving him comfort because, unlike with everyone else there, something in Adam wanted to cry because of that one fucking sound. He found himself stepping closer, his fingers reaching out, lingering lightly on the other man's knuckles. Sparks sizzled between them. If Adam cared to believe, he could actually see them. On the second stroke down, Justin's fingers moved, brushing back, connecting, showing Adam it wasn't one-sided. Their gazes locked, though it wasn't a stretch. Justin wasn't that much taller than Adam was, though their physique was completely different. Where Justin was buff, built like a rock, Adam was willowy, easily picked up by the wind. He knew he wasn't the worst person to look at. Hell, if he let himself actually believe anything that was said about him. He understood he was hot, but he couldn't quite believe it. Couldn't quite get the voice of his father and brothers out of his head as they told him how it all made sense, that he looked like a girl, so it wasn't that far a stretch for men to want to fuck him like one. Granted, that had not been the biggest problem. No, it had come from all those times he'd listened to his brothers going on and on about the things they told their women to get them into bed. Worse was when his father had come in, laughing and giving them advice on how to get laid in 2 easy steps. Only the things they'd said had been exactly what he'd seen in the men around him, not his friends, but the ones in bars and clubs, all wanting his arse for one thing and one thing only. Good news was that he'd learned what he'd liked from those types. If they didn't give a shit about Adam, why should he have to care about them? And if no one in the room gave 2 shits, then all it was that free for all, the winner, sexual gratification. Justin's eyes held a sad edge. They were so soft, they lit up Adam's inside, making him tingle from his toes up, licking at his balls before caressing his chest, his neck, running through his hair. He wanted to lean in and take a kiss, something sweet to go with that softness, but he wasn't sure if it was his to take. Like, yeah, they'd fucked, but when had that given a man rights? Even so, Adam leant in close, their lips touching. A hot dry brush was barely anything, but it held that same spark, taking him away from everything, the fact that others were around him, or even the idea he might not be welcomed in taking what he wasn't given. Adam couldn't help but step into the kiss, their bodies lining up to perfection, and the slight need to tilt his head gave Adam a sweet little kick of lust he needed. It would be better because he knew he wouldn't hurt Justin's neck or have him complaining of the same thing. Could be kind of a mood killer if the mood hadn't been set properly. Justin's hands landed on Adam's hips, pulling him in close, still grinding them up nice and tight, making Adam shudder and want to pull Justin off into the long grass so they could get some open zippers and moisture mixed in with their lip lock. Their cocks lined up, pushed, shoved, and rocked against each other, their mouths attacked. Yet Justin stayed this side of courteous in a way men had always treated him. Only Justin had fucked him, and still he treated Adam as if he was his goal to treasure him. Treasured. That was what it tasted like, what was happening here from not only Justin but also Adam in return. Adam wasn't the type of person to only want something and not give it back. He'd made a point of being himself, of showing Justin how much he needed him, though he was holding his tongue, holding back what truly needed to be said. He was kissing Justin with emotion, with a hope and a prayer that the other guy would hear his pleas and would stay. Justin was kissing Adam as if he was something he wasn't quite sure he could keep, and yet he wanted to. Adam could feel it in the way one hand ran up his back, soft and gentle, with an edge of lust that wanted to take over everything. But unlike Adam, Justin hadn't lost his head. Adam swayed in joy. His mate, in front of everyone, was kissing him. He was being owned up front and with witnesses in a way he'd only ever dreamed of. And he was right there giving all that back. We'll have to get the final word from boss man, but I think you're right, Craig said, his voice cutting through the lust as if he'd sprayed them with a hose. Justin pulled back from the kiss, licking his lips before looking over Adam's shoulder. What? I think you're right. We should fight, but it's not our choice. We don't have the final say. Who the fuck does then? Justin asked. Something shifted, or maybe that had just been Craig, but it got Justin's attention, and even though he didn't take his hands off Adam, he turned his body looking up towards the house. Adam looked too and saw Eamon standing there against the rail, strong, Steady, a lion looking over his charges. Brad, Kyle and Chris were leaning against the wood beside him, but they didn't demand notices, not like the boss. In the house now, Eamon said, his words carrying across to them. It wasn't hard, and the way the land was set, he could have whispered his demand and the wind would have let them hear it. This was different. This was controlled anger, and it made Adam flinch as he linked his fingers with Justin's and quickly stepped to do as Eamon wanted. No thought, no hesitation. Eamon wanted them in the house, so they'd be there. Adam's heart beat a little faster, not liking the anger lining the boss words, especially when Eamon could have directed it at any one of them or all of them, or at Justin. Sucking in a sob, Adam tried hard to push that thought away. He loved his family, he loved his life here, and he didn't want to leave, but if Eamon kicked Justin out because of what had just happened, Adam would go too. He'd leave everything he owned and loved for Justin without a second thought. Maybe that should have scared him more. Chapter 8. In the house. In the fucking house, as if they were all kids doing something they always did. Justin wasn't sure if that was completely true, but it was what it felt like to him. Adam laced his fingers with Justin's as Justin watched Eamon and the others turn and make their way back into the place they were all heading. It was another one of those weird moments with Eamon barking and the boys scattering, but what was truly interesting was how he'd acted, not being able to stop himself as Adam dragged him along. However, he wasn't truly being dragged, since he hadn't felt the need to stand his ground. So caught up in his own thoughts, it took him until he reached the bottom step to notice Adam's death grip on his hand and the fact that it was cold and sweaty. Justin stopped, and with a small tug, had Adam facing him as his free hand went to Adam's shoulder. As he looked into Adam's eyes, Justin's throat went dry. He didn't know what do with all that fear, but it was the determination in those beautiful eyes that made his heart hurt. What was going on in that head of Adam's to have so much emotion from something that didn't even seem to be directed at anyone, at least not that he could see? He was unable to say anything, simply because his throat didn't want to work, but would rather have said that it was a fact that he had no words, nothing of comfort or reassurance. They weren't his forte. They weren't his life. Justin found himself pulling the younger man into his body and letting his lips say words he didn't even understand. Adam, in return, leaped at him, making Justin take his weight as he returned the kiss with something that tasted like happiness, or at least as close to it as anything he had ever had near him before. It didn't take long for Adam to pull back. This wasn't like the kiss they'd shared before. This wasn't mouth to mouth because Justin couldn't do anything else but kiss the man. This was deep, meaningful, even if he didn't know what that meaning was. Even if he didn't want to take a moment to figure it out. He wasn't stupid, just a coward. With a smile and a bounce in his step, Adam continued leading the way up the stairs, still attached to Justin with locked fingers that hadn't even taken a moment to break as they kissed. The rest of the journey happened without thought, and Justin found himself with his foot up, stepping into the cooler interior of the house, back to where he'd first walked in with Adam in his arms, bleeding. Wait, shit. Justin was an arse. He'd forgotten everything. He'd forgotten that his lover had been injured, been fucking shot, and he'd not taken one simple moment to ask him if he was okay, not even fucking thought about it. About the fact that he might have needed someone to remember. This needs to stop, Eamon said sharply, making every thought in Justin's head stop. Hell, his feet did too, one inside the house, one out. The boss man was standing in the space between the lounge area and the dining room, his hands on his hips, looking around, but didn't seem like he could catch a thought. Justin had the same thought, Craig said, throwing him into the spotlight. Eamon's eyes flashed to him, taking him in, seeming to judge him in a second. And unlike the dismissing eyes he'd seen in other men who had such power, Eamon seemed to see something that mattered. Justin wasn't sure what, but he just understood the fact that when Eamon turned to Craig, he hadn't done it because Justin was beneath him. He'd done it because he needed more information, and Justin didn't have it, but he felt it, that link into the conversation he'd never had with any other person in his life. Justin swallowed down hard, coating his dry throat as he took in a huge breath. He wasn't going to ever admit had a hitch to it. He felt a sudden need to flee. It was as if someone had dropped down on one knee and he knew a ring was going to come out. Everyone did. The person standing was already starting to tear up. Emotions drifted around the room, clogging up the atmosphere. And all Justin wanted to do was pull out his gun and shoot one of the fuckers in the head because he couldn't handle even being in the room with that much soppiness. He suddenly felt completely out of his depth, that he was needed more than he'd ever been needed before. Why did that fill him with so much terror? Maybe it was belated shock. Adam, the shooting, the need, wants, and thoughts that had made him find a way to fix things instead of just doing what he had to do, take checks and leave the rest to their own makings. He shifted away, turning his eyes so he was looking at the ground, feet filled. His view, fingers tightened around his, soft, a gentle grip, supportive. They started a trickle that calmed him, and suddenly Justin could breathe again. And what thought was that? Eamon asked. Justin's panic had only lasted less than a second. Stand and fight, Craig said, his back straightened, his head high. He was on board, wanting it all as much as Justin did, and from the flicker of his eyes to his boyfriend Phil, he probably had the same reason to want this to be over as much as Justin did. Shit. No, he wanted. And how are we planning on doing that? Chris snapped from somewhere behind. Eamon. Not we, Craig replied smoothly, a smile curling his lips. You guys won't even be here. And where the fuck will we be? Chris shot back, again rising up and walking to stand just off to the side of his boyfriend, Eamon, arms crossed over his chest, thick red bands. Were they marks left over from the night before? Making it look all the more impressive. Werewolves, Craig said with that same smirk, as if a plan lingered just off script. So we will be there, Chris snapped, his face flushing a little. Technically, I suppose, Craig bushed off. Fucking hell, Phil. You need to take your man in hand before I take him out back and beat the fuck out of him. What? He looked around, and so did Justin. All the boys, those he now realized were werewolves, were looking as if they wanted to help Chris with his beating. Craig threw up his hands. Oh, fuck off. You say that shit all the time, and I think I've been really fucking good at not calling you guys what I used to. What? Like calling us dog? Chris snarled the last word. That was Dan, and Craig threw up his hands. I ain't going to win this argument. I can't help my past. I can't help where I came from or whom I'm going to run into and what I'm going to need to do and say to keep you all safe. Why the fuck is it even being questioned now? Because now you're trying to get us to go to fucking war for you. To kill people for you. Chris yelled across the room, spitting anger as if he were throwing knives. The words seemed to startle everyone. Justin watched, enchanted by the play of the men in the room, mainly Chris, who was clearly worried about his brothers and himself when they'd be in werewolf form. Justin had seen men like that. They would kill anyone without hesitation that got in their fucking way. However, he'd never thought about what the person behind that beast would have to say about it. Would they remember when they came back to themselves? The worst thing was, something was underlying those words, something dark and twisted, and if Justin had to guess, it had to do with something to do with waking up to blood and death. He understood what that felt like, even if he'd taken that path, embraced that world, and made money for the trouble. But his hand, linked with Adam's, came up to rest against his heart, comforting himself while reassuring Adam. Justin's thumb rubbed against the working class knuckles, trying to soothe him in a way he'd never done before. Hell, he'd never tried to soothe anyone before. He'd never had a reason to. It was unnerving how much that simple movement made him feel, as if maybe the simplicity of action, of a touch, actually meant something, actually helped. He had a moment to wish he'd realized that before he hit 30. Craig started, his eyes dancing from Phil, who sat on the lounge. Craig was standing behind, to Chris. I didn't mean. Who were you thinking would be behind the guns, Craig? Eamon asked, his voice smooth, not taking a side. Justin and me, he said simply, matter-of-factly. Sounds good. Justin put in, using that same tone. He didn't have to make it that way. Just came out. Killers. It was one of those professions people thought someone was natural at, or that they were without conscience, but it wasn't true, not always. Justin had laid out his first kill. It was simple, easy, maybe a little too much, and because of those thoughts his gut had hurt for months after, as he saw flashes of his kill every time he closed his eyes. He'd pissed buckets as he waited for the cops to show up and take him away. It hadn't been that bad an option, in his opinion. The guy he'd killed needed to die, and yet it hadn't been his decision or some other holier-than-thou people who thought they were better than everyone else liked to say. Justin Might not have had a right, but if he hadn't stopped the bastard. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the memories with the bile. He wasn't sure why he was thinking this, but it probably had something to do with the kid who was holding onto his hand as if he didn't want to let Justin go. The utter relief from no one catching him had been his downfall. He'd gotten cocky, arrogant in the fact that he could do this one thing and no one would ever know. His second kill hadn't been that much easier. Oh yeah, the adrenaline kicked up high, and it had stayed with him as the days passed. It had been a stronger kick when the arsehole's picture had flashed onto the television, his body pulled from Darling Harbor, along with all the other rubbish littering the water. His heart had stopped the first time he'd seen it. Just the picture of the dead guy's ugly mug, a description and a plea for answers by people who wanted their 15 minutes of fame over the loss of a brother, sister, son. They couldn't give two fucks about until the moment cameras were shoved in their faces. He'd gotten away with that one as well, and it hadn't been hard. The arse had so many enemies, so many people willing to piss on his fucking grave that Justin had been a blimp, but like the first kill, this one had been revenge. He craved the rush. The old man, Jex's dad, had been the one to find him. It hadn't been long after his second kill, as things like that generally tumbled quickly. He was an addict. His rush, the adrenaline that flooded his veins, not so much as the moment happened, but as he waited for the cops to come calling, and then that sweet shift as the fear and worry left him. 48 hours, that was how long it lasted these days, if he'd even gotten that far. Because after that it was unlikely they'd ever link him. And he knew, depressingly so, that they wouldn't find anything, not anything he hadn't wanted them to find. Now it was just a job. It had been that way for a while, and as soon as he'd fallen into that position, he'd been able to gather a warrior's outlook on how life and death worked. He much preferred it on the life side, but didn't have high hope of seeing old. Chapter 9. Adam needed to sit down. He'd been standing so still, his arms and legs were starting to cramp. His fingers, the ones that were holding onto Justin, were trying to dig their way into the flesh, trying to grab hold of bones and hold on for the rest of his life. Adam could already feel the shiny reality of love deep inside. He could already feel the connection so strong he would die if he didn't get to keep Justin, let alone what it would be like if the man chose to walk away. This feeling had only come around once before. He'd been a nice man, older John, a man that made Adam feel like he was the whole world and that just being around Adam was all he'd ever needed. In reality, Adam had only been a summer fling. He believed John called it a free pass from his wife and kids. He was bi, and apparently had convinced his wife that if she didn't let him have some time to fuck men, she'd lose him to someone who would. Adam had been fucked. He'd fallen so fast and so deep, he'd felt as if his heart was spilling out with every beat. He honestly thought he wouldn't make it through those first few days, but he had, and though he'd seen every fuck after for what they were, he'd always wanted a mate, lover, life partner. He'd waited and waited for that one person he was expecting to spend the rest of forever with. And here he was, standing next to Adam, his fingers still twined. Even as Adam clawed at him, it was as if Justin understood that need to be close, to have Adam as close to him as Adam needed Justin to be. If only he wasn't talking about being one of two men in a war against an army. In the silence there seemed to be smaller fights fought around the room, all making him uncomfortable. All Adam wanted was to make it better, to find a way to smooth everything over, but he had no idea what he needed to say. However, maybe it was more about him not paying attention to anyone but himself, which made his stomach tighten up with guilt. A soft squeeze to his hand made everything in Adam's head still as he realized the time had come for Justin to need blood in his fingers again. But when he tried to let go, Justin tightened his own, pulling Adam further into the house. Justin put Adam down onto the lounge next to him, getting him right up into the curve of his body while he sat sideways, watching the group all as one. And Adam sat there, looking at Justin because he was just that sort of sap. And he was okay with that. "Thank you very much. I'll help," Jex said into the silence, a rush of sound as if it had been a hard fight to get them out. Matt shoved his chair back harshly as he paced away from his lover, obviously needing to release some aggression. And with those simple words he turned the number into 3. Didn't make Adam feel any better. "See, no one's asking you guys to do anything," Craig said. "Course not," Chris added. Hard sarcasm laced his tone. "But let's face it. We aren't going to be able to stop it, are we? Our mates are going to be in Danger. I don't see that being a problem. Craig spoke softly, eyes very tellingly, not flickering towards Phil. And what do you have planned for us? Phil asked. His tone made Adam smirk as a little song sang in his head. Craig's in trouble. Absolutely nothing, Craig said, his face turning to Phil. This meant Adam got to see the look that passed between them like a fight. Lingering between the lines. It was a bad one and the mood wasn't getting better with the topic at hand. Adam could see that. He could also see the steam coming out Phil's ears, nearly hear them whistle with anger. He didn't think they'd break, but they were definitely heading hard towards a collision. Adam had tried to keep out of their trouble, even as he sat down cuddling with James and Chris watching some bullshit on the telly. However, like everyone in the house that day, they hadn't been able to stop listening. It had been the first fight between mates, and he believed for a lot of them a reality check. That there wasn't anything different between being mated and being married. Not in Adam's eyes, at least. His parents had gone at it as if they were trying to rip each other apart with words. They had been cruel and they had been physically aggressive across the room. It had scared Adam when he was younger, thinking they were going to hurt each other, but all his worry had been laughed at, not only by his brothers, but his father and mother as well. As he'd grown older, he had just gathered he was the black sheep, only his deformity came with actually showing he cared about someone else. It had all been a big flashbang of rightness when he'd realized he was gay. When the words got put in his mouth, understanding, enlightenment. He wasn't like his family, not the ones that birthed him, but like the ones he chose to hold close to his hearts. The people that needed him, allowed him to care, to worry, and to be there for them when they needed him. Those who stood around him now were his family, and one of the newer members was going off to war, and he was dragging Adam's mate along with him. Adam didn't like this. He didn't want his mate to leave him. It was as if the possibility of his mate going off without him, off towards something he did every day, was like he was going to lose his mate before he had him. A mate that was most definitely not going to walk away from him. A man he was destined to love, and had started to fall for as soon as he understood what Justin was to him. Adam lost his thoughts. He wasn't particularly sure he was making any sense. Anyway, so it was obviously for the best. His body slumped slightly in his chair, his fingers cramping from staying in the same position for too long, but Adam wasn't going to be letting go of Justin's hand anytime soon, not if it ended up being the last time he got to hold him. Because once the fight was over, and there was nothing left to hold Justin here, he'd leave, maybe as soon as the last body dropped. Hair rippled under his skin in response to his thoughts. His muscle shifted in odd ways, showing the wolf inside of him wasn't a happy camper. It was so bloody close to the moon. Adam could feel every moment of its calls, the cries inside him as the wolf screamed to be let free, to take hold of his mate, hold him tight, biting him, claiming Justin so he'd never be able to leave them. Fingers brushed the back of his neck before running across the top of his back, just under his clothing, resting for moments before moving into a slight rub. A caress from Justin, who else soothed Adam as quickly as anything else could, like a hot chocolate under a big quilt, sweetly overwhelmed by the presence of his mate. Tears pricked his eyes because it was all still there, the threat, the need to fight, and this person, this man who was everything to Adam. It was everything Adam wanted him to be in a package that no one was going to trust. Are you going to use us as bait? Adam's voice seemed a little lost. Sharp inhales of breath came from all around him. Adam wasn't sure who had done it, or if they all had, but the sound allowed him to come back to the room. He pushed away the thoughts he didn't need to think about and became aware of things he needed to understand. Fuck no, Craig said, eyes large as they looked at Adam, fear lingering in the whiteness. But that's definitely what we'll be. Adam muttered the words. He hadn't meant to, but his mouth had spoken truths as they came to him, letting him learn what they spoke as everyone else did. No, you won't, Justin interjected. Justin's remark made Adam want to smile. It was a hopeful moment. Maybe Justin was feeling things for him even this early. Maybe he wouldn't have to wait months of agony before his mate returned to him, or Adam went to find him. How else do you plan to get them to you? Adam asked, stunning himself into silence, as well as everyone else, it seemed. Craig opened his mouth, then closed it. His hand went to Phil's shoulder before he leant over it, his head resting on the other man's. Whatever problem they were going through definitely wasn't something he was willing to lose. Phil over. It wasn't anything he was willing to put his own mate at risk for. Words were mumbled, personal words between the two of them, and held all the meaning they needed to, and then something to make him laugh to cut the mood. They don't cancel each other out. Phil laughed. Fuck they don't. Hell no. You getting bit by another man is totally higher than unknowingly suggesting something that would lead you into being bait, Craig stated. Your way could get me killed. Phil protested with a laugh. Everyone in the room knew nothing would get Phil killed, not with Craig watching over him. Hurt maybe because, as Craig said, shit happens, but not killed. Yours could get someone else killed, much worse. Craig snapped back. Oh, fuck off. Phil again working up a good steam. Boys, as fun as this is to watch, can we move this along? Eamon said, his own fingers protectively around the back of Chris' neck. Sure, Craig said. I think Justin is right. We need to fight. We need to protect our own, and at the moment one of own is sitting in a cabin protected by an old witch of a woman who could have been just that. In that cabin lies information that would be very helpful to you all, but even more, the building holds secrets my father will do just about anything to get. So I believe we act now. If we choose to stand now and fight, we won't get a better chance. Eamon hummed. Sounds good to me, said Jex, much to Matt's growling. Sounds like fun, Justin put in. Justin's statement made Adam swallow hard, but he wasn't going to add his own worry. He couldn't, not without knowing Justin, not without understating the man's pride. And this battle. Do we need to do anything now, or can we continue? Breakfast. Since we set up the sensors around the cabin, we should be fine. They all have a destruction mode to them, Justin said. Really? Chris replied, excited for the first time since this whole thing was brought up. They blow up too? Yep. Just that simple. For Justin, maybe it was. All I gotta do is press a button and they become a mine. Or I can press another and up they blow. That's fucking awesome. I didn't know a weapon like that existed. Of course, that is, if you know the right people. I got mine from a dude who is an email away from being a terrorist. He's a fucking genius and loves to tinker. He the one who made your car? Brad asked. Justin looked over at him. Yep. No wonder it didn't go up as it should have. It's still there, right? Justin asked, shifting onto the edge of the seat. Brad nodded to Justin's relief. Yeah, we told them we'd get rid of it since it was one of ours. All right, boys. Eamon clapped. Let's eat. It almost seemed as if he wanted the idea to disappear, maybe even needed a moment to digest what was about to happen. Adam settled back as everyone started moving, getting food onto a plate. Chairs scraping as men sat. It was not so much awkward, but definitely like a dream. Too many minds trying to think of something to say and coming up empty. Chapter 11. Fucking hell, Adam was in love. He had to be right. There wasn't any other explanation, not since he wasn't laughing his arse off at himself from the embarrassment of blurting out bullshit that couldn't possibly be true. The worst was how much peace he felt as his words settled down around him. How his heart beat double time in his chest as he waited for the man to crush him. Just because he was in love didn't mean Justin was, and it certainly didn't mean he should have said the words out loud. Really? Adam let his mouth wander, not even thinking of catching the words as they'd readied themselves to leave his mouth. No. Instead, he allowed them to escape. It was such a harmful thing to do. So self-destructive. He should start thinking about seeing a shrink. Clearly, he didn't want to find happiness, and he certainly didn't seem to want to keep it. Telling a man he loved and in turn loved him, well, he wouldn't do that until he was about to pull out rings, right? Justin had frozen above him. Adam wasn't sure what was going on inside that head because it seemed to him that nothing was, which was kind of scarier in his opinion. At least he wasn't rolling off, Adam thought. He wasn't trying to put as much distance between himself and Adam as he could humanly possible. He wasn't trying to laugh it off, make a joke, and pretend Adam hadn't laid out his heart, even if he didn't mean to in the first place. No, Adam's best guess was that Justin was thinking really hard about everything, working out shit that Adam couldn't even see, or even just what he was feeling. That would be the best outcome, Adam hoped, because even if Justin was just trying to figure out a way to get away from Adam, he was going to be doing it as nicely as possibly, or he wouldn't still be there. Then the man smiled. It felt as if Adam had been waiting for an emotion for ages, but he was sure it wasn't nearly as long as he thought it was. Wait, did that make sense? That tight-lipped smile looked down on Adam with confusion. Adam wasn't sure if it was because of what he'd said, but there was definitely no running, which was made crystal clear when that face come closer and lips brushed across his own. Soft, delicate, it made Adam's chest feel tight and his eyes burn as he witnessed the sweetest answer he could have ever gotten. Justin. No. Adam wasn't ready yet. He didn't want the kiss to end, even though it was only dry lips against dry lips, and clearly not something too deep, only meant to be simple, sweet, just the way it was. Justin. Craig. Fucking Craig and his need to get Justin's attention. What a wanker. Justin laughed. It was a soft chuckle, and when Adam looked up at him, those eyes were laughing with Adam. Wait, had he spoken out loud? Yep. Justin mouthed, kissed him again, quick and simple, and jumped up off Adam. Wait, when had he done up his jeans? Adam's head thumped back onto the ground and he let out a sigh. He didn't want to think, he didn't want to wonder, and he definitely didn't want to get up and start back in on just how much firepower they were going to be using, and the reality that death was coming to these lands soon. No, didn't want to have to think of any of this. Adam wondered if Justin would come back down here and join him again. They could forget about everything if only Justin would lie back down on top of him. Justin smiled down at Adam, shaking his head slightly before putting his hand out. Adam death stared the arsehole who'd interrupted them as their hands slapped together, and Justin pulled him up, keeping their bodies lined against each other as he got his feet under him. The man in front of him then brushed a kiss against his jaw and walked towards Craig, calling out something that showed a friendship sparking up between them, which had Adam smiling. God, he loved that man. Justin had a smile on his lips as he trotted along the grass towards Craig. Was just as he suspected. Adam had fallen in love with him like a 12-year-old with a crush on an older man. Everything seemed to be working exactly the way Justin had predicted it would be when he first saw that kid look up at him. Though what Justin hadn't expected was how those little words he'd always thought were so insignificant and useless in his life, had his heart beating against his throat, made him want to repeat them back to Adam to make the horrified blush fade and go away, to get him a smile worthy of someone well worthy. Worse still was how those words rooted him to the spot on this land, making him want to settle down or fight for the life they deserved to have. One that didn't come with people trying to kill them. To be truly honest, if he wanted to feel like being true with himself for once this lifetime, it wasn't the words, but the look of pure horror on Adam's face, before it tampered down to a defeated kind of wonder, that made him want to mark this land as his and make sure everyone knew to stay the fuck away. Not thinking, he'd kissed Adam in a way he'd never done before, had never even seen before. It made him vulnerable and important to a person who could rip his heart out and feed it to him, and worse was he'd be okay with that. Wait, what? Okay with? Oh, fuck him hard and hang him out to dry. He was in love with the little fucker too. Okay, probably not in love, but there was definitely something there, that same thing that had been there from the beginning, the one that had him caring for a person instead of taking a prime opportunity to take his mark and return home. Justin swallowed hard. Not home to the place he worked, because if he thought about it and thought hard, the only place he truly felt like he belonged was when he woke up with Adam in his arms, safe and sound. The only place he'd ever felt like he was truly accepted was in the dining room in the house that loomed up behind him, talking about what they were going to do, not looked over and dismissed to do a job for someone else. The only place he'd felt like himself, and that it was okay to be the man he was and not something someone else wanted him to be. Justin wiped his brow as he slowed down from the jog, coming closer to Craig. This was more than just helping, because he could, and for a long time he'd understood that. He wasn't a stupid man. He'd just let himself believe otherwise by not thinking about what he was doing. If he stopped to think, would he truly be able to take Jex and walk away? Though the better question, the one that actually needed to be asked, was, would he be able to walk away? Justin's heart did something funny inside his chest as his gut twisted up in the way it did when he was about to walk into a trap. Only this time it was screaming that leaving was the wrong choice. So, did that mean he was going to stay? Even more, hadn't he already pretty much concluded on that matter anyway? Hadn't he come to terms with the answer he'd never realized he'd made? Wasn't this just show ponying about, pretending that he wasn't caving like the little bitch he was? You all right, dude? Craig asked, making Justin realize he'd actually made it to the man and had been standing in front of him for a while without saying a word. Hell, more like spaced out, which should have told him how bad the idea of being with Adam was. It's not a bad decision, Craig said, slapping him on the back. Huh. You think I don't know what you're thinking? Craig laughed hard, his arm settling across Justin's shoulders as he started moving them towards the trees, towards their goal. It happened to be one more perimeter sweep before they headed in for dinner. Yeah, Justin muttered, shifting Craig's arm off him. All's fair and all right. Something like that, Craig mumbled as they reached their first checkpoint. The thing is, I do know what you're going through. Nah, mate, yours was probably worse, Justin said as he lifted himself into the tree, making sure to do it roughly and sloppily. Who knew how things were going to go down, and he needed to make sure the gun wouldn't fall off in a rush. Craig huffed a laugh. Yeah, okay, so my problem was the werewolf, but what I'm trying to say is life isn't meant to be lived hard and fast. It's got to have some stillness to it. Maybe. Craig shrugged. You particularly want to die in a year or two. Or you're just used to the time limit, realize the truth of it, and are okay that it's probably going to happen. Probably the second, Justin said. And it's got nothing to do with that. Shit. I'm not scared of leaving my old life. If that's what I've been living. What's the problem then? Boss will come find you. Nah, he doesn't give two shits about me. Like, yeah, maybe he'll get someone else to come for Jex, but it'll be a long time coming. Craig nodded. Sounds like a stellar dude. He wasn't too bad, just wanted a son more like him than Jex's bitch of a mother, which is what he knows he's got. The thing is though, Jex's mom. Justin looked out into the tree, remembering the spitfire of a woman that had birthed that kid. She was a black widow. If it weren't for the fact that she got busted killing a mark just after Jex's 7th birthday, then she'd have killed off the boss just for his title. Yeah, I'm not sure what he told Jex, but that woman, she was quiet, small, and she would kill with a viciousness that was beyond anything I've seen. It's one of those big-headed male things, I think, that makes the boss not see that his son's probably more killer than he could ever be. Hell, I thank the gods he held on to that heart of his, because he would have been a scary man if he lost it. Huh. Craig scratched his neck. Made you uncomfortable now? Nah, Craig murmured, pulling away from the tree. You finished with this one? Yep, let's hope the fuckers come to it. Justin smiled. He and Craig had 3 plans running, only one of them known by the rest the house, the other 2 just specials created by Jex, Craig, and himself. I ain't worried, Craig said after a while. More curious, I guess. I've lived with Jex. I know he won't hurt anyone, at least not any of us. Justin nodded. I've never seen him attack anyone that hadn't come at him first. His dad didn't really teach him anything but how to hold a weapon, which sucks because most of the time you're kidnapped you generally don't have those things. So you're saying Jex needs hand-to-hand training? Justin shrugged. It definitely wouldn't hurt, though I think that for everyone. Another nod. I've been thinking about that lately. I want to maybe start up a class, get all the boys up on at least pro-level self-defense. I'm in, Justin said, getting a large smile from Craig and a pat on the shoulder. So maybe he'd made up his mind. Chapter 12. The first scream of the night flapped and lifted into the sky like a flock of birds being startled, loud and heartfelt, dripping with the pain that caused the man to yell in the first place. The battle had begun. Justin had been lying in the grass along the top hill, the one holding the house, hidden in the deep shadow cast down by the bright moon. They'd found themselves in one of those horror movie nights, the moon bright, hanging low in the sky, bringing light to every corner it touched. The wind settled and the world was silent except for the howls that had rung against the night an hour earlier. Craig said it wouldn't take longer. Apparently they were in a rush, or stupid. Justin wasn't sure which one had them trying to sneak up to the cabin. Rushing was for fools, and apparently this group had a lot of them. Justin smiled. Daniel and Jean had joined them halfway through dinner because Jean couldn't be there when he shifted and needed the fuel for the big night to come, but they had decided that Dan should end up back in the cabin, last line of defense, and all that. Eamon was joining him, a point they had argued about for longer than necessary. Tim was the one who made the stubborn man realize none of them would be safe if something were to happen to Eamon. Tim was with them both, wanting to be close to the action and scared because they knew who he was, that he'd become a target and he couldn't put his parents through that, though Justin knew it was more about him than anyone else. Not that he could fault the dude for it. He knew what it was like for a normal person held captive, and the nightmares that would follow. It wasn't that he'd gone through it, but he'd put others in similar situations and he'd seen them years later, still scared of shadows and men they didn't know. Tim was the one who ultimately made Eamon nod and follow along after the other. Two men he could see the fear and the need for reassurance from someone whose opinion held meaning. It didn't take long for the world to settle again. Justin wasn't surprised. He knew whom he was up against. It was time for some big game hunting. Rolling out from the patch of grass he'd settled himself in, he picked up his spent brass and went on rolling down the hill. He'd made the shot. He'd started the fight. Making it to the bottom of the small incline, he got his feet under him and headed off into the trees, his mind forced on one thing and one thing only. They need to get this done quickly before the werewolves made the wide sweep and headed back to them. Craig had told him how they worked as werewolves and the patterns the boys took every moon. It was said softly when they had been double-checking everything because they didn't know that Craig had taken many notes on their behavior. It wasn't really his fault if one thought about it. More habit and the need to protect because Craig had done it out of love and safety, which was the only reason he told Justin what their patterns normally were. Even though he could tell the guy left huge chunks of it out, Justin didn't mind, mostly because he didn't care. Up in the tree, the floodlights had already switched on, lighting up in a strobe effect for 2 minutes after the first man hit the perimeter. It was to confuse them and allow Craig, Justin, and Jex to know they needed to come in closer. That's how they worked it, take the fight to the cabin. They may not have been using the werewolves as bait, but that was because they weren't the reason these men were here, not this time. Justin was in the tree, straddling the branch as his gaze focused to aim. His finger pulled the trigger when he had what he needed, and the bullet rapidly shot forward, landing in one of the men's shoulders, cracking the bone and turning him around as he fell onto the ground. Agony a song on the breeze. At the same time, Craig and Jex would have taken out a few of the stragglers. The night fell again. It was darker than before, eyes needing a beat or two to get used to it before they could begin to see. Blinded, Justin was already on the move. He knew where he was going and needed to get there before the shock wore off. He was the furthest from the battle, and probably the only one that wouldn't hesitate to kill. He knew Craig was going up against his family, his old man, and that took a lot of nerve to pull off no matter how much he hated the man. The same blood ran through their veins, making it nearly impossible to pull the trigger. Jex was a sweet soul with a nasty bite. Bites were only good when there was something to trigger them. Yeah, people shooting or trying to kill you was definitely a trigger, but a person had to get to that point first, and that could be dangerous, especially when the person on the other side of the gun was better at killing. Men were wounded, caught in the trap they'd set, and as Justin arrived to his spot, he'd already put a bullet into the head of one of the bad guys, killing him instantly and making a mess all over the pretty flowers. The cottage was in disarray, the perfection of it all ruined by a second round of gunfight and blood. A man screamed, running off, most likely back in the direction he'd come. Justin didn't watch. He wouldn't be trouble. Either Jex would get him or he'd be left stranded in the bush while everyone else he knew and worked with burnt in their fiery graves. No one else was getting away. This was it, the end, and Justin would hunt each man down this night if he had to. There was no way Adam was living through another day with this hanging over his head. Son, one of the solid men said, clearly the leader. He stood up high, his back straight, looking at Craig as if he'd rather be pissing on the kid than talking to him. Justin didn't like the look, but it wasn't his battle. It didn't have anything to do with him. He'd already dealt with his own deadbeat father, which was enough for one lifetime. Oh, so now I'm son, Craig said, teenage attitude dripping from his words. Maybe it would fool his old man while Craig stayed strong. Justin saw that look in his own reflection. Craig wanted nothing more than to end the man's life. He just had to work up the courage. No, that wasn't fair. It wasn't courage. It was talking the humanity down. It was about being able to live with becoming that bad a person, a type of person that finds it okay to kill his own father. The man whose DNA ran through his veins and the one that raised him. Though Justin knew that Craig was aware. Justin would have killed him in an instant if he'd been given the opening. It took a lot more for a son to do the same thing. Everyone stood still, waiting, watching, knowing that someone was going to die. Most knew it was going to be them, but men like this, soldiers to the 'Cause whatever their cause might be, knew the ultimate goal when they went into the battle. They knew they might not see the next day. They made that sacrifice with a vow, one that was all about taking as many people down with them as possible, leaving the ground they died on littered with their enemy. It didn't matter which side of the fence one stood on, it was the same, and even if a person was on the side of evil, they didn't think themselves that. No, they were fighters of the cause of whatever they stood behind. The other side was the enemy's. How did he know this? As he stood there, gun up, vowing the same fucking thing if it was to come down to it. Like most of the men here, he didn't want to come out the loser. He was willing to sacrifice himself for what he believed in, for what had brought him here in the first place. A scream sounded in the distance, the runner dying quickly, and then the growls. Fuck. Craig's old man spat. You hear that, boy? He snarled at his son. That's the sound of death. Move aside, we both know you aren't man enough to kill me. Aren't I, old man? The gun sounded before the bloodshed began. The battle was quick. They had all been a little distracted by each other for anyone really to put up a battle. A werewolf in its horror sequence gore ran into the group of men. Teeth, claws, feet, and blood sliced against each other, marking the land and beast, slashing the rest of them as more turned up, then standing on the outer edge, panting and growling, but ultimately watching as one werewolf went nuts, killing everything in its path and then doubling back to make sure he hadn't missed anything. Justin wasn't sure who it was. He hadn't seen them change, at least not up close. Hell, he couldn't even tell if it was Adam or not, although he dearly hoped not. He didn't think his man would be able to deal with the aftermath of this killing spree. The grunts ended and the werewolf stood up, growling around in circles, looking for more victims before settling on Jex. It took a step forward, its snout and claws dripping with blood. Bloodlust shadowed its eyes, making it look like a thing of true horror that Justin hadn't seen for a long time, maybe not even as a man but as a child. When a shadow across the room would be his worst nightmare, all there alone in his room with him. Another step and the werewolves came forward, shifting themselves in front of Jex, Craig, and himself, making themselves a wall between the crazy and the humans. A loud growl answered the move and then a bang of a door. Enough. Eamon's voice rang like a bell across the land. The wolf looked at him, standing there in the middle of the circle, only a hand stretch away from the werewolf in the middle. I said enough, Jake. Eamon's voice was softer, more caring, and then demanding. You did well. Thank you. The wolf growled low, a morsel of sound before he threw back his head and howled. It was breathtaking. A chorus sounded after him, ringing against the darkness and the blood, connecting them. Justin was sure. At least that was what it felt like to him. Connection. It was beautiful. They then scattered off to play or eat or whatever it was werewolves did alone in the woods, leaving Justin standing there with his gun and the rest of the humans. Well, that was anticlimactic. Jex sighed as he came forward, shuffling around the dead, not seeming to be bothered by the whole thing. But then why should he? He'd seen this more or less many times in his life. Justin huffed a laugh. Definitely something different, that's for sure. Though better than something long and drawn out, Jex countered. I'd have hated to break a sweat. He laughed. Shame about the cottage, though, Justin followed up. Yes, but if you think about it, it's a fitting end to the fairy tale of it all. Justin looked around. I suppose, though, a fat lady in a kiln would have been a sight to see in this day and age. Jex chuckled. It was definitely the ending that should have come with all these werewolves running around. Yes, dear boy, I do believe you are right, Justin said, putting his arm over the other man's shoulder, which was a bit of a task as Jex had grown taller in his years. So are we staying? Jex asked. He wasn't a stupid man but just wanted a different life. Was that too much to ask for? I suppose so, Justin said, his lips twitching a little as if that hadn't been obvious to everyone around him. Epilogue. Pulling the chair in as Adam sat down before he rounded the small intimate table, Justin smoothed his button-down shirt and tried not to feel like the world was watching him or that something was about to come out of the woodwork as he turned his back on the restaurant and focused on Adam. His whole back shuddered and twitched from a moment of not knowing what was happening behind him. He didn't like the vulnerability of not knowing what was going on behind him. It was almost as if he could feel every single eye on him, even though he knew no one in this place gave a shit about him. He wanted tonight to be special. Justin wanted something that was just the two of them, and then, hopefully, that look of loss on his man's face would leave. We can swap seats, Adam suggested. I'm good, Justin muttered as he shifted in his chair. He wanted to show Adam that he could completely focus on his lover and no one else. He'd had this horrible feeling the man felt neglected over the last couple of months as Justin helped Craig get the boys up to stretch on self-defense as well as helping Eamon get the best equipment and information to secure the land they were creating as a sanctuary for all the lost little werewolves around the country. The worst had happened when he'd gotten word his new car came in, and Adam had started pulling back, started making excuses not to spend too much alone time with him. When they'd both made it to bed, though, Adam had cuddled up to him, holding on like he'd not been able to let go. There'd also been a part of Adam he held back that he wanted to keep safe, and Justin wasn't sure why. What had he done? Adam looked over Justin's shoulder, making Justin's hackles rise. He needed to see to make sure there wasn't anything there that could hurt Adam. His shifting positions made Adam chuckle. Let's just switch, he said as he got up off the chair. A wee bit relieved, he walked around, choosing the same side as Adam, giving the man he loved a kiss on the way, holding him close, making sure he'd be a bit breathless when he sat in his own seat. They were in Bathurst, a country's country to a city boy like Justin. No, that wasn't right. He wasn't a city slicker anymore, and he needed to stop thinking that way. If he'd ever really thought about it, the town itself was bigger than he'd thought it would be. It was nice, quaint, and kind of yuppie at the same time. Contrast of new and old. The town was awesome. Definitely somewhere to visit. Which was the reason Justin had picked it for his car to be dropped off and for a night out with his mate. Yeah, mate. That had come as a shock. Not long after the men had come into the woods and taken over the cleanup, he became aware he was Adam's mate. He hadn't realized what it meant at first. Yeah, he could get the picture, and he'd heard the way they spoke to each other. But Adam had refused to talk to him about it, and Justin had let it go because at the time he felt Adam had said too much without getting anything back from Justin, so he couldn't show his hand on this one. The waiter came and went, food was delivered and eaten. They spoke in soft tones about everything and nothing, things couples did when they were a perfect fit and didn't need the word to show them that connection. Yet Adam needed something. Justin knew that, and when dessert came he stopped Adam's hand, grabbing his fork. I've got something to ask you, Justin said, feeling heat lick at his face. He hoped what he was doing was the right thing, that he wasn't about to get laughed at, or worse, that Adam wouldn't walk away because he'd been waiting for Justin to walk out the door instead. Insecurity didn't sit well for Justin. He didn't like the feel of it, didn't like the fact the emotion was even a possibility for him. He was always confident in everything, but Adam had been acting funny, and Justin had a hope. That was all, just a hope. Justin? Adam asked. It seemed it wasn't the first thing he'd said. Sorry. Adam swallowed hard, fear making him seem smaller than he was. You wanted to tell me something. No, Justin clarified. Maybe he did have a clue why Adam was acting the way he was. I want to ask you something. Big difference. If you say so, Adam said, his voice sounding too small, and he had a lot of trouble looking up at Justin. When a black velvet box slid into Adam's vision, he gasped, his eyes flickering up at Justin. Those beautiful eyes held a slight hesitation, but otherwise, magic. They held magic and everything else Adam had ever wanted them to hold. He couldn't finish. His voice just didn't continue. Didn't. Was Justin asking? Justin started flipping the box lid open, showing off 2 silver and black bands. Adam wasn't certain, but he thought there was a pattern in all that blackness, but he'd need to pick them up to know for sure. That too, and dry eyes, because as soon as the lid snapped open, his eyes started watering. This was completely different than what he thought dinner was about. Mostly since Justin's car had been fixed, and especially since the new one was delivered, he just knew Justin would leave him for good. He'd been so sure about it that he'd been trying his hardest to protect himself from it. Now, he felt like shit, as if he'd let his mate down. Adam, will you marry me? Justin asked softly, hesitantly. Hearing this melted Adam's heart into a puddle inside his chest. He stumbled. I need to tell you something first. That I'm your mate? Justin asked, sounding confident for the first time in the last couple of minutes. How? You told me well accidentally and then I asked Craig who filled me in on the rest. Is that why you're asking? Hell no. Justin jumped up, moved Adam's chair out and knelt between his legs. This is because I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Justin picked up one of the rings inside the box. So will you? Are you sure? Adam asked, his hand moving into Justin's ring finger, separating from the pack. Yes. Justin laughed as he slid Adam's ring onto his finger. The ring settled into place. Adam scooted to the edge of his seat and kissed the life out of Justin. His fingers went to find the other ring. He fumbled a bit as there was no way he was going to let go of the kiss, not yet anyway. It was too important, but then so was finding the other ring. Once he had it in his hand, Adam leant back, his fingers shaking as he picked up Justin's hand and slid the ring onto his finger. That's a yes then. Justin laughed. It was light and full of a happiness Adam had never seen in the other man, but hoped he'd always get to hold on to. Yeah. He also laughed, his arms around Justin's neck, leaning towards him, searching for another kiss. It's a yes. They kissed again and then Justin was back in his seat and they were eating dessert as if his world hadn't just been completed, hadn't become everything he'd always wanted it to be. Eamon looked around the land he knew they owned. It wasn't just his anymore. Hell, it had never been his to begin with. Men littered the area under him, little ants doing what they always did. They were building fast, mostly because Eamon had money to back him and the weather had been good to them, dry and easy to read. They'd already placed 6 of the 12 cabins into the woods around the house he and Daniel owned, which backed right into National Forest. They owned a lot. Each cabin had been pre-made and designed. All that the men needed to do was clear the small area and place the cabins where Eamon plotted before, connecting the water and electricity they'd put through the property 5 days before the trucks had turned up. They'd used wood from the area they lived on, and they looked wonderful. Eamon knew it would mix back into the forest quickly, which was what they hoped. Not so that they were hidden, but so he wasn't ruining the nature of the land they owned. He loved it here in this town with these men, but he also needed to help people. It was the reason he'd gotten into psychology, that need to make what was broken fixed, to help people manage their own emotions and their own lives better. This was a step in that direction. He had the lands, he had a safe place for people so his boys can come and be safe, even for a little time, at least a moment before they went back to their lives. Eamon wanted to make sure what had happened to his boys didn't happen to anyone else. He wanted to make sure werewolves would have a safe and sound place to rest and be themselves. There were plans at the start to have a bunkhouse for those who needed to place to stay. However, he didn't like the design patterns, not liking the eyesore it would have created, which would have been fine if they'd been on a farm, but living in this area would have ruined it, so Eamon had come up with another plan. Cabins, little ones, big ones, all littered into the woods. Places for people to stay, to rent out, to live forever if they were a good fit, if they needed a place to stay. Small arms wrapped around his waist. Eamon leant back into Chris, loving the feel as he watched his world. People watching with the love of his life at his back made everything else a better place.